Okay, hopefully everybody can see this. And thank you very much again, indeed, to Rolly for a wonderful introduction. And yes, my name is Professor Nat Warren, and I am now living in a beautiful place in New Zealand, having previously been based at the University of Edinburgh's Dick Vet School. I'm extremely honoured to have been asked to contribute to this equine welfare seminar, and I'll be talking about the use of a one welfare approach for advancing animal welfare. It's particularly poignant to be talking about the one welfare concept at this time when the world has shut down, overseas travel has almost stopped, and sadly we've been unable to welcome you wonderful international colleagues to the planned World Veterinary Congress in New Zealand. But it is amazing to see you all in the chat room, and I welcome you all at whatever time of the day it happens to be. But the current situation does give me a very good start point for my talk. This isn't the first time the world has experienced the emergence of a previously unknown or new strain of a virus in human populations who have close contact with wildlife and other animals. And this won't be the last time that we'll need to recognize the significance of external factors, such as human encroachment into wild animal habitats, wildlife trade, humans living in close proximity to one another in urban environments, and poor animal welfare conditions. The interconnectivity between humans, animals, and the environment, and the negative effects of placing one or other of these under pressure have been played out through numerous pandemics over past years. Where the welfare of animals is of a low standard, there's a real risk to human welfare. Although COVID-19 is indisputably of major concern for humans worldwide, there's also growing concern for global animal welfare. In the short term, many companion animals have experienced quite significant changes to their lives, and in some cases this could be said to be for the better. However, it's likely that we'll also see welfare problems for many of these vets as we emerge after lockdown. Increases in behavioural problems, such as separation-related anxieties in dogs, as well as the impact of reduced exposure to other animals, for example, for puppies during socialization. These are just two examples. And these sorts of things will have a longer-term welfare impact on those pets and their owners. But by far, the most significant impact on animal welfare during the aftermath of COVID-19 will be related to the worldwide economic downfall as a result of borders being closed, lockdowns, businesses unable to operate, and loss of jobs. This in turn will mean that governments will reprioritise funding at the expense of animal welfare. The public will have less money to contribute to welfare organisations, and there are likely to be more animals given up or abandoned due to their owners being unable to afford to keep them. The knock-on effect of lowering standards of animal and human welfare will mean that there's greater risk of transmission of existing and possibly new infectious zoonotic diseases. The complexity of the animal welfare debate is far broader than most would think. Setting aside the current situation, there are numerous factors that influence the way an animal is perceived and treated, including culture, religion, the history of the human-animal bond, and the utility of the animal and its value. And when working in countries where most of the world's animals live, and where human welfare concerns are paramount, it's often difficult to justify a focus on improving animal welfare. So animal welfare is certainly extremely complex, and especially at times such as now, in the midst of us dealing with a massive human welfare event, it can seem that advancing animal welfare is akin to trying to boil an ocean. However, with animals being key to sustaining local and national economies, being used for food production, draft, providing employment, representing people's primary income, and offering human comfort, improving animal welfare standards to ensure human welfare must be integral to effective disaster and recovery planning. There's no doubt that animal welfare issues are diverse and plentiful, with lots of different problems depending on the species, the country, culture, and circumstances. And for equines, the nature of traditional management, training, and their use gives rise to a variety of welfare problems, ranging from their behaviour, methods for encouraging performance, work expectations, health, and general management. Animal uses, traditional practice and management conditions that put the animal at risk of living a poor quality of life have often become normalised and accepted by society. And when this is the case, it can be extremely difficult to shift the baseline of what is normal to practices or circumstances that lead to better welfare outcomes for the animal. Humans, by their very nature, are resistant to change, especially when there's no apparent good reason for them to do so. This change curve illustrates human reactions to change. In this case, the examples I've provided are of horses, are of horses kept for long periods in stables or stalls for competition or performance, and the use of extreme pressure in training for things like dressage competition. At the start of most change processes, the majority of people are generally happy as they are and certainly don't see any need for change or why change is relevant to them. And of course, they're highly resistant. Shifting the baseline relies on being able to demonstrate, normally through good evidence and education, and also sometimes some sort of change event, that a new normal has benefits for that person. It's at that point that they're prepared to explore and potentially commit to some sort of change that hopefully will benefit the animal's welfare. So if we're to shift the baseline for many animals in a world of competing agendas so that we move closer towards animals living a good life, we need to find an approach to advancing animal welfare that focuses not just on what's good for the animal's welfare, but also why that change is beneficial for humans. And this means that we need a different lens through which we can view animal welfare. And this is where the concept of one welfare comes in. It can provide us with a theoretical and a practical approach to various conundrums where animal and humans' interests are intertwined. And one welfare now seems to have gained a lot of momentum. You'll see a number of talks about it today, and it's been adopted as a useful lens by the veterinary profession. The focus of much of the work I've been involved with over the past few years has been to promote one welfare as a way to help drive the animal welfare agenda forward in countries where there are significant and often competing human welfare concerns, and where animals and people live and work in close proximity to one another. Although the labels are new, the concept between one health and also one welfare, one welfare are not. Virchow coined the term zoonosis and described the transmission of certain infectious diseases between pigs and humans more than 180 years ago. What is new is that there's been a shift in the focus of modern veterinary medicine, with today's veterinarians becoming increasingly aware of the important role they play as advocates for animal welfare, and the need for them to look beyond the physical health of an animal and to be concerned with behavioural needs, animal emotional health, and the impact of poor animal welfare on human well-being. Veterinarians are increasingly practicing within a one welfare framework as more links emerge between human and animal well-being in relation to modern diseases such as obesity. For example, it's been reported that between 22 and 44% of household pets are likely to be overweight. And Peter Sander and his colleagues have argued that human and animal obesity are linked. If the owner is overweight, then it's likely that their animal will be too. Understanding the reasons for human obesity, as well as the relationship humans have with their animals, is important for finding ways to deal with these sorts of modern human and animal health concerns. There are various approaches to this, and this was certainly the subject of a recent research project that myself and colleagues carried out here in New Zealand, where we embedded an animal health and welfare program into an existing human health initiative. Overweight owners that had already attended a community-based health and exercise class were also asked to bring their dogs along for a weigh-in and a health check. And we used this meter or a measurement tool that had already been something they were familiar with for their own health recording or their own welfare recording, and we asked them to keep track of their pets' welfare too. The Patu pet checks were extremely well attended, and the owners were quite enthusiastic about being able to use this sort of assessment tool for themselves and for their pets. And certainly it improved their understanding of their animals' behavioural needs. The increase in equine obesity has given rise to equine welfare charities operating in developed countries, identifying this modern phenomenon as the greatest threat to equine welfare due to associated health-related problems and also the negative impact on the horse's behaviour. In addition, where the rider is also overweight, there are further negative consequences for the horse. And unfortunately, similarly to the companion animal, the pet dog and cat story, it's often the case that you find overweight horses and ponies are owned by overweight people. So just as with the caged canary who provided an early warning signal that was relied upon by miners for their own safety, so too can we make use of animal welfare issues to detect and explore human welfare concerns. And one example of this is the link that is well known about animal and child abuse and domestic violence. And this has been something that has been extremely well studied. And the communication between key professionals representing both the animal and human welfare concern has been shown to ensure that threats to human welfare can be detected early and can be acted upon. Guidance for veterinarians and health and social work professionals regarding how to recognise non-accidental animal injuries and to recognise the signs of abuse through observation of pet-animal responses provide an extremely good example of the One Welfare approach in action. There are numerous other examples of where there are knock-on effects for humans related to problems with animal welfare, and one of these includes the way in which management, handling, confinement and housing of production animals can lead to higher levels of stress and poor animal welfare. When an animal is in a situation where it's exposed to challenging living conditions, initially it responds by trying to gain control through changes in its behavior and its physiology. However, if this doesn't work and the animal becomes chronically stressed, then there'll be changes in its immunocompetence, and consequently, it'll be more susceptible to disease, it will grow less well, be less productive, and potentially need more veterinary treatment. Not only is this bad for animal welfare, but this situation can also lead to problems for human well-being due to a reduction in food safety and food security. And where there is increased disease susceptibility, there's often the need to use precious antimicrobials on a mass scale, leading to concerns for human welfare in the longer term. Keeping animals in conditions where stress is at a minimum and their welfare is good means that risks to human welfare can be reduced. The link between improving animal welfare and benefits for human welfare is particularly important in poorer economies and where people rely directly upon their animals for their livelihoods. There are a whole range of factors that will influence the welfare of working animals, and many of these, such as cultural norms and the financial situation of the owner, are extremely difficult to tackle. However, improving the animal owner's awareness and knowledge about better management, healthcare and handling will certainly lead to better health and can often lead to improvements in the animal's work productivity. The equine that has received better care provides the owner and his family with a whole range of benefits, including a better chance of higher income and ability to provide for the family's needs. Changing attitudes through owners seeing the human benefits of improving an animal's health and welfare is a powerful tool now used by a number of animal welfare organisations. And finally, before you think I've just forgotten that this is actually an equine welfare seminar, I just want to relate this back to equine welfare in places where horses are mainly used for recreation and sport, and in particular address concerns regarding the safety of humans around horses. Horse owners and veterinarians are regularly faced with issues related to the natural behavioural responses of this wonderful large prey animal. It's evolved to be highly reactive, with well-honed sensors for detecting danger and equipped with effective defence and escape responses. The accident statistics illustrate that riding horses is a serious business, and unfortunately accidents are all too frequent, with horse riding being considered a high-risk pastime. In fact, it's been said that horse riders are 20 times more likely to have an accident than a motorcycle rider. So there's a lot to be concerned about in relation to human welfare, especially when they're working around horses, whether that's being on their backs or on the ground. When hospital statistics have been analysed, many of the accidents are reported by owners or handlers to be due to the behaviour and training problems of their horse. Interestingly, owners don't seem to be too aware of their own contribution to the risk of an accident. What is often underappreciated in the contribution that owner handlers have to causing many of these problems is that there is an impact on the horse's welfare of the methods that they have been using. Horse training often involves the suppression of unwanted behaviours and the shaping and reinforcing of new ones. Horses being highly emotional will, if placed in a stressful situation through being confused, frightened or frustrated by the lack of competency and consistency in application of pressure during training and riding, react in a variety of ways to try to escape or deal with the stressful situation. And these sorts of conflict behaviours that you can see here are all symptoms of the animal trying and failing to cope, and of course being in a poor welfare state. Many horse owners and handlers actually have very little training or knowledge about horse ethology. They might have a lot of experience, but they don't necessarily know too much about the nature of their horse. And they certainly don't know much about learning theory. And as such, they're actually ill-equipped to prevent problems from occurring or to deal with them when they arise. Sadly, not only is the animal's welfare impacted, but also all too frequently, so is the rider or handlers. And horse accidents are common, and sometimes, sadly, these can be fatal. So what about the equine vet who's on the receiving end of the badly trained or conflicted horse, and who also may be contributing to heightening of the negative emotional state of the horse because of trying to treat or investigate a painful condition? Well, on average, during a vet's career, they will sustain about 8 work-related injuries, and most of these are associated with dealing with horse cases. Equine vets that report that they feel that they put themselves in dangerous situations with horses every day or a few times a week. And it's not surprising that 81% of equine vets, when surveyed, have said that they sustain at least one injury every 5 years, an injury that puts them into a hospital. A way to improve owner and veterinary safety is to gain an understanding of equine behavioural needs, indicators of increasing arousal levels, and the correct application of learning theory in training, as well as indicators of stress in the animal, particularly during a veterinary examination. This doesn't only improve the quality of the experience for that animal and so its quality of life, but of course it also reduces the risk of injury for the person interacting with it. And promoting an improved awareness of equine ethology and learning and indicators of positive equine emotions is one of the main drivers for the work of the International Society for Equitation Science. And there's a number of publications in this area. And if you want to learn more about research, the big arrow there indicates the link that you can go to check this out. So in conclusion, using a one welfare approach can be a useful way to make animal welfare relevant, especially where there are potentially conflicting human agendas. It can also be a way to help shift the baseline of what is considered to be normal practice through changing human behavior by changing their perception of the importance of the animal's welfare for them and their welfare. And viewing animal welfare through a human lens doesn't detract from the importance of improving animal welfare for the animal's sake, but it just provides more reasons for more people to value animal welfare, which of course will benefit many more animals in the long term. Thank you very much indeed for listening.
Thank you, Rowley, and thank you everybody for attending. In these troubled times, I do hope you're all safe out there and well, and long may it continue that you're safe. And I hope we all will turn a corner soon, and the next time we meet will be face to face. So yeah, thank you, Rowley. The title of my lecture this evening is Assessing the Impact of a Welfare Project, quite a large subject. We've got a whistle-stop tour through multiple parts of looking at a project and how we assess whether a project is indeed successful. So the first question we need to answer is, what is impact? And the simple thing to say is it is the so what, or why do you do a project? And the second question is, who cares? Or why did you make a difference because of your project? So it's basically answering those two questions. So what, why did you do it? And who cares? Did you make a difference? More specifically, impact is reporting the verifiable differences you make to the lives of people, and indeed, obviously, in a welfare situation, the lives of animals. And why should we care? Because the process of collecting your data, allowing you to monitor and evaluate your project, and produce an impact statement at the end gives you masses of feedback, okay, to your organization yourself, to allow you to track your progress, to monitor your effectiveness, to learn and change the projects as you need to. It gives feedback to donors. It builds their confidence. It allows industry representatives to see the evidence of your work, that you are accountable for the money you spend, effectively increasing the value of your work. It gives feedback to organizations such as the Charities Commission, other funding bodies or other organizational bodies to, again, see the evidence of your work. And importantly, it gives a voice for the beneficiaries, the people you actually serve. It ensures that the project is in context, and it gives them a sense of ownership regarding the value of that project to them and to the wider communities. And if you don't believe me, it's all out there. Impact is everywhere now. It is so important to consider impact as part of your normal organizational structures. But it is estimated that over half of developmental projects fail to meet their objectives. And if that's the case, how many of us fail to have an impact? So, question, when should we consider impact? The answer is everywhere, in any project. I know the talk is on a welfare project, but you can include impact in a commercial activity, building a mobile clinic, building a hospital, making a new premises, as well as in training opportunities, the treatment of wounds, the administration of preventative medicines. Impact should be considered in every single one of these modalities to ultimately provide, at the end of the day, a statement of the value of your work. And it's called an impact statement. It's quite a simple thing. It is a brief summary, in lay terms, of the welfare, economic, environmental, and or social accomplishments that you undertake. It is the accomplishments and their payoffs to society and the animals you serve. Now, I know the talk is primarily on welfare, but I hope by the end you will see that actually the economic, environmental, and social impact elements are just as important to welfare as has already been discussed by Nat, for example, to the overall outcome of your project. An impact statement is not a description of the activity or a number-based document. It shouldn't be, we treated 1,000 animals because we found they were injured. That is not an impact statement. Instead, it is a presentation of the process of your project with the data that you collect, but with an explanation of why or how it made a difference, be that difference positive or negative, or indeed no effect at all. So you're trying to answer, so what? Why did we do this? Who cares? This is how it helped. So what is this process? I've basically put it in pictorial form here for everybody to see. It is a 6-stage process. Firstly, we have strategic planning right at the beginning. Then input, which is the resources you provide for a project, whether that be veterinary equipment, staff members, training of staff, the activities you run, running clinics, training community members, the outputs those activities achieve, number of treatments you provide, number of people you've trained, then outcomes. How did those outputs result in change or effect in the lives of working animals and their owners? Did you decrease number of wounds? Did you improve welfare? Did you improve body condition score, for example? Did you improve local knowledge? And the impact is then looking at those long-term changes as a result of those outcomes. So we're going to run through those steps. The first one, strategic planning. I put this up, if anybody wants a little bit of a laugh, this is the play pump system that was developed and used in Mozambique and Zambia as an example of poor impact, where they developed this play pump system, basically a merry-go-round that children would play up, suck up water into the container units here, and that was the plan, that was the project plan. However, the cost of putting one of these in was about 20 times the cost of putting a hand pump, and for children to play on it and suck up water took about 20 hours of spinning the actual wheel. So poor impact. But have a look at strategic planning, your first step. The first thing you're going to do is effectively ask the question, do you need a program? Or what is the need for a program? And this effectively gives you baseline data. That baseline data is collated from, for example, animal welfare assessments, if it's an animal welfare program, from owner surveys to collect knowledge, from focus groups, from key informant interviews, again, to collate the information that will form the basis of your project need. Then you have to apply the project to your own theory of change. Obviously, each organization will have different strengths, and you hope that your theory of change model, your approach to resolving a problem, will fit the problem you have identified and that baseline data. And then you would develop what's called a log frame, which is effectively a monitoring and evaluation system of the program you intend to put in place. You would run a program and then compare your post data with your baseline, and that will give you an evaluation tool. So this is the kind of thing you might find. This is the kind of data baseline you might create. So this is from Segu in Mali. This is one we did a couple of years ago. You might look at poverty indexes, what the average salary is, number of people relying on it, on the donkey, whether there's infrastructure, the actual evidence of welfare need, the types of injuries, the percentage of wounds that you found, for example, how many donkeys there are, how many people rely on them, knowledge of the owners, etc. So you're going to have a mixture of qualitative and quantitative data, and it should reflect at least one of the impact statement indices: a welfare measurement, an economic value, an environmental quality, and a social element. And importantly, this data is important to who is listening. Most importantly, it's for you. So your data needs to reflect what you need from your project, what will inform you the best as to the effectiveness of your project. But also, cynically, it will also inform funders or reporters or donors, all these kind of people who exercise some kind of control of your program. And their attention is limited. They only want vital information to make decisions. They want quantifiable evidence of the differences you make. So the bottom line is, it affects your future potential for funding. So if you want to attract the attention of people like this, you've got to know your audience. You've got to know the type of data that this kind of donor is interested in. This is what has been called effective altruism, and it's a big thing if you're going to collect data that isn't interesting to people who might give you financial assistance. So step one, you've done your strategic planning, you've identified a baseline, you've identified the kind of data that is necessary, it fits your theory of change, and you're going to start to build what's termed a log frame, which is effectively a monitoring and evaluation tool. It is a table that illustrates your overall objective and your key stages, so the activities, the outputs, the outcomes to reach that overall objective. And it should reflect your theory of change. So in Spana, we would run mobile veterinary clinics, provide community training, distribute equipment to aid the welfare of animals. We would treat those animals, hopefully seeing the long-term reduction of wounds, longevity of animals, and improve local knowledge to ultimately result in a welfare change regionally and nationally, and social change within those owners. It defines what we're going to deliver and how we're going to measure it. So again, our activities to start with would simply be, how many animals do we see? What training have we done? And moving on up in a further way to look at deeper methods. So have we seen ultimately a reduction in caseload? Have we seen a reduction in severity of wounds, for example? Can we study the knowledge of the owners as their information changes by a participatory assessment, for example, to show that we're actually getting change there? And where there are risks or assumptions, we need to put those in. For example, when we first run activities, we may not get cases presented to us. People may not be interested in learning. So we may need to change our project as it evolves. And for that reason, it's important that we don't allow a log frame such as this to be entirely rigid, to define exactly what will happen. Projects change, and if you rely entirely on a log frame, you might get stuck. What I'm going to do is move back, though, to a process chain. It's very similar to a log frame. It's probably a little bit easier to understand versus a log frame. For the purposes of this talk, we'll kind of stick with this process because it's easier to understand. So we have the same thing. We have an input, our activities, output, outcome, and impact, but we're also putting in our assumptions or our risks. We're assuming that our training is effective, our equipment is suitable, the materials we give out, and the communities we meet all want to have that input. Our activities, again, are well received, and so on and so on. Our outputs are delivered, our outcomes are achieved, so we move then ultimately to impact. But importantly, as I've just said, at each stage, similar to our baseline data, we are collecting information from each stage so that we can evaluate the progress of the project moving towards impact. So, step two effectively is input. You've done all your studies, you decide to input into the program. You give your resources, you develop MOUs, due diligence, health and safety, you financially assist, you develop infrastructure, you put in staff personnel, you supply materials, medicines, training materials, etc. You're inputting into the project itself. Your activities, you're actually then going to run your project and start to collect your monitoring and evaluation data. So your project could be protecting animals, providing food, treating animals. These are your inputs, the resources your organization devotes. Your activities are ongoing, the training, the setting up of community groups, the running of clinics. And you're going to start to generate output data. These are direct, immediate term results, such as how many animals have been treated, How many people have attended a workshop? How many community awareness meetings have been held? So you're going to start to develop direct information. So, for example, this is output data. This is the number of animals seen by Spana in 2017, just over 222,000. And that data can be expanded slightly depending on how you record it, the requirements of your organization, who you intend to use that data to explore it with. So we can break it down into clinical cases, preventative measures, humane equipment, or indeed specific diseases that we want to follow, or welfare indices that we wish to follow to indicate that change in welfare and on a long-term basis. So hopefully now we're moving towards impact evaluation. We're moving away from what did we do to why did it matter? What changes have we started to see? From output, we move into outcomes. Outputs are easier, I've said. You just count them. How many animals treated? How many meals served, for example? But an outcome is thinking about the effect or the change that your program has started to produce on this problem that you have identified in your baseline. It is measurable, but it is also time limited. For example, you might initially identify wounds as being a big problem. And then with treatment, with time, with education, the wounds change from being treated to hopefully seeing a long-term change, for example, in body condition score of the animals. And then again, over a period of time, improved working hours of those animals or improved working performance of those animals. But that's a time-limited effect. It will take time to see those changes. The outcome will inform the success of your program. You might train people, but training people is not an indication of knowledge change. It may be that you train people, they actually then go out and get a job and they maintain that job for a certain period of time, they develop a wage. That is informed success and an outcome. So measuring these changes, these outcome changes, requires a more significant input from yourselves. And you may have to track it for a much longer period than your program actually runs for. So what do we look at when we look at outcome measurement? For simplicity, we break it down into the 3 E's: efficacy, efficiency, and effectiveness. Efficacy is effectively saying, has the project solved the problem we set out to solve based on our baseline data? Efficiency is measuring your project, comparing it with other potential projects, or comparing it with the actual funds you've spent and trying to decide, is there a better way to do it? And effectiveness is effectively describing the wider social effects that may be because of your project. They may be positive, they may be negative, they may be unintended or intended, but there are wider social effects that you may change. And these are also known as impact indicators. And if you can answer these questions associated with your projects, then you have impact assessment. So, for example, efficacy. Project is hopefully solving the identified problem. What type of cases did we treat? How much equipment did we distribute? This is output data, but when we come to outcomes, why did it matter? How has it actually changed the health and welfare of the working animals changed? Or how has the health and welfare of these animals changed? And what things do you need to measure to inform yourself that this has happened? Efficiency, comparing your process with other potential ways and with other cost-saving ways. What did you do? You provided funds and staff. Were they within budget? How much money did you actually spend? Why did it matter? Did the project suit the animals in that particular contest? Did the project build capacity and knowledge versus the alternatives? Is it self-sustainable for the money you put in? Or is it replicable or scalable, effectively self-sustaining? Thirdly, effectiveness, the wider macro effects of your project. So what did you do? We taught people through community training. We taught vets as well. And why did it matter? We wanted long-term local attitudes and beliefs towards animals and animal welfare to change. We wanted the long-term effects to have differences on the lives of working animals and on their owners. So we need to think about, how do we measure this? What indices can we measure to prove that our input and our outcomes resulted in a change in all that long-term, effect upon people and the animals? So we moved from monitoring and evaluation of what did we do? We treated animals, we collected data, to why did it matter? The impact. Are these 3 donkeys on the right, are they fat now because of our project? Or are they fat because of excessive rain that year and the grass growing? Is this child attending school? Is this donkey well because of the impact of our project? Or is it there's been legislative change within that country demanding that he attend school? So we need to ensure that our information is non-biased. And in all 3 questions we asked, are these changes attributable to us, to our actual activities? Are our assumptions correct, or are our risks totally incorrect? Or were we wrong entirely? Did we have any change at all? Was it entirely just numbers based? Do we then need to refine or change our project? So in effective summary, after the initial stages of planning, baseline, fitting your theory of change and developing a log frame, you go into a 3-phase period. A monitoring, which is your output data, the collection of information. Your evaluation, looking at outcomes, effectively looking at, was the project of quality, was it of worth? And then looking at impact, the long-term changes attributable to the project's activities. So we need to put it all together to effectively go right back to the beginning and say, what is that impact statement and what makes a good impact statement? Remember, we said that in brief summary, it is that welfare, economic, environmental, and or social impact of your efforts, stating your accomplishments and their payoffs, answering, so what? Why did you do it? And who cares? How has this helped? We need to at least answer 1 outcome question or impact indicator over a longer timescale. So, was the welfare change fitting an efficacy or effectiveness outcome or impact indicator? Was it of economic value to the people and indeed to you? Did it improve or demonstrate an environmental change? Has it influenced society, individual well-being through behavioural change, knowledge acquisition? These are the key questions you will answer. But really, the most important person you're answering it for is for yourself. Are you working effectively? Was it worth it? It's for you and then for your recipients. We're asking the questions, are we using our resources effectively? Are we addressing the root cause of the problem? Are we targeting the areas where we have the greatest impact? Can we or do we need to change that project? Where can we make those differences? Where can we make those improvements for ourselves and the people that we serve? Or do we need to go right back and change the whole lot? And it's important to be open and honest to accept that that may be the answer as well. And lastly, it may be you think about this for your donors or your audiences. It's most important for you and the people you serve. So I need to give you an example of it. This is an example, or it's actually not an example, this is a real term from a project that happened in Mali and Segu, so we have the same data sets. So in 2012, we identified a significant number of injuries caused by harness wounds. We invested £150,000 and undertook an education and training program aligned to the treatment of animals and the appropriation of harness materials. And in a full impact statement, we would add all the data that surrounds that. So this is an example of our research, our baseline, our log frame, M&E. We move on to the next part, starting to generate output data. Over the course of 2 years, we saw the number and severity of wounds reduce in our clinics, and we saw a reduction in infectious conditions such as tetanus. And we again add our research data there. So we're starting to demonstrate a welfare change, one of the key parts of an impact statement, which is also an outcome answer to efficacy. We are seeing changes in the welfare of animals. Over the course of 7 years, we determined an increase in working lifespan of the animals, an increase in wage of the associated people, and an increase of attendance of children at school. This was directly linked to those people who had attended training and animals receiving treatment. In other words, it is non-biased. It was attributable to the program. So we're affecting welfare change, economic change, social change, and it's non-biased and answering outcome questions. It also led to the direct training of harness makers and production of harness pieces from recycled materials for local people in the region. So again, we have an environmental aspect, a social impact aspect. This was entirely unintended, but that's not a bad thing at all. And it also shows that you have a sustainable project that is potentially scalable as well, so demonstrating an economic component to it as well. And lastly, it also, however, led to an increase in the hours worked by animals, necessitating a project refinement to provide education on appropriate working schedules for animals. So it's a negative effect as well. It was unintended and means that we need to go back to the project and redevelop it to make sure we include elements of increased animal welfare with regards to rest and work and food and water alongside this project. So that's a whistle-stop tour through impact assessment, how to do it very briefly, all the different aspects of an impact assessment and how to generate one, and latterly an impact statement. Thank you for listening. Do take care, stay safe, wash your hands in these difficult times, and I hope to speak to you very soon.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you to you for the introduction. God alone knows what Rolly Horse is going to say about you if anybody gives him the microphone. So I'm delighted to be here speaking on behalf of the Donkey Sanctuary. I live close to the south coast in Ireland. It's still bright here. It's not sunny, but it's rarely sunny in Ireland. You'd be very welcome to come and visit here after this COVID-19 pandemic has passed us by. So I want to pick up on a few comments and share further about a couple of topics that resonate with what Ben has already spoke about, measuring impact, but also Nat, who spoke very much about welfare of equines, how important that is to us. And we, of course, in the equine welfare organizations are very much focused on horses, donkeys and mules, and so we keep them at the heart of our work. So I've titled this Donkey Welfare Assessment, Hearing Their Voice. And it's amazing still how much goes back to the 5 freedoms. Of course, having a catchy phrase has helped, but it's quite incredible how many people around the world have an understanding, people who know little or nothing perhaps about animals, but they have a sense and understanding of the 5 freedoms. And we in the equine welfare world have moved on considerably from here, not to carp about it, of course. Now, for our current understanding of welfare, they perhaps are somewhat phrased negatively. They talk about freedom. 4 of them talk about freedom from, so negative. So we have we've moved on, and a good life. We really now want to focus on what is a good life for in an animal species, whether it be horses, donkeys, mules, dogs, cats. Wildlife, etc. What is a good life for that animal? So we really, to gain an understanding of what is a good life for an animal, we have to get inside their heads, we have to get inside their minds, we have to understand more about what it is to be that animal. So we want a good life for these animals, not just a life worth living, and certainly not a life not worth living. And I certainly, when I started as a veterinarian, was very focused on resource-based indicators, the things that we provide to our animals, the housing, the shelter, the feed, the bedding underneath, etc., etc. But that's one particular focus that we have, I think, moved on from now, is to be much more animal-based in our measurements, and it's very much core to our work that, as Ben has said, that in projects that we assess the impact of the work that we do, and there's no better way to do that, of course, than to study the impact of our work, of our interventions on the animals themselves. This, of course, is another approach. The 5 domains model developed to look at welfare assessment. And here's another one, and I'm just running through these very, very quickly because, of course, I'm going to move on to the Donkey Sanctuary's one newly developed tool. But welfare quality protocol and projects within the European Union built upon the models previously developed by such as the Five Freedoms. And our colleagues in a sister organisation in Brook developed a welfare assessment tool for working equids, for horses, donkeys and mules in working environments. This has been a very successful tool used by their organisation and others in welfare projects in assessments, just or similar to as Ben has described for SPAN in the last presentation. And within the European Union, a formal project sponsored by the European Union called the ARWEN project looked at welfare assessment for a variety of species, and the Donkey Sanctuary was very much involved in the development of welfare assessment tools with the university colleagues in Milan University in northern Italy, looking in particular at donkeys. So measuring donkey welfare and donkey well-being, well, why do we do it, and why do we want to do it specifically for donkeys? Well, as Rowley has told you, I did at many stages to my career, thought I knew everything, and I've increasingly understood how little I do really know. But one of the things I have very much learned is that donkeys are a different species. And I was as guilty as I think many of my veterinary colleagues still am, of treating donkeys like small horses with big ears. And they're not, and they have a very different repertoire from a veterinary perspective. If we were just to think, and I know on the panel we may come back to this subject as to how different donkeys are in terms of their physiology, their biochemistry, their pharmacology of veterinary medicines, and we have to take these factors into account. But an element of donkeys, and indeed other equines, that I was very much not attuned to in my early veterinary career was their behavior, and how animals express, or in the case of the donkey, may not express their needs through behavior. And we have donkeys, of course, across the globe that find themselves in very many different situations. The vast majority of them are domesticated animals. Of course, there are some feral donkey populations, but the majority of them are domesticated, and they may be harness animals, real beasts of burden, they may be companions, they living, as it were, what might appear as a life of luxury. They may also, of course, be production animals being farmed for their meat, for their milk, and their skins, which is certainly a subject I'm sure we're going to come back to later on this evening, or this evening as it is in Europe, and this morning in New Zealand. So measuring welfare then. Well, we want to know how an animal is coping with its life and with its environment. And this harps back to a famous definition of welfare by Professor Bloom of Cambridge University. And Rowley has mentioned Cambridge because, of course, it's his alma mater. What is living a life worth living? And if an animal like a donkey is not living a life worth living, then what are the issues in that animal's life? How can we describe them? How can we study them? How can we collect data around these? And can we build up a pattern here? Because as Ben alluded to, for welfare organizations running projects, it's really important that we understand the impact of the work that we do, the impact of interventions. So if we do intervene, do we make a positive difference? Or do we, as Ben has said, sometimes potentially make a negative difference? And we need to know that quite quickly so that we can stop what we're doing. The old Latin in veterinary school was primum non nocere, which means first to do no harm. So we do not want to make interventions that are harmful. Can we use our evidence to persuade others to act? Because, of course, in the world in which we operate, we need evidence. We need, in our advocacy work, we need to be able to persuade others. Perhaps, as Daniela alluded to, they might be in the big global organizations, the United Nations, the FAO, the OIE. We need this evidence in which we can persuade them to work with us, because they will see the benefit to them, to their cause, as well as, of course, to the cause that we're interested in. And in our work, we are also sometimes involved as a position of last resort. We're also, of course, sometimes involved with legal matters in court when there is obvious cruelty at play. And I'm thinking a bit more about our more domestic work in the UK and Ireland when I make that comment. So the eye, of course, of an animal as ourselves is said to be the entrance to the soul. And we need to look into the soul of these animals to better understand what is their life experience. As Ben said, we need to do this as part of projects. We need baseline information so that we understand what the situation is before any interventions. We, of course, need to monitor the impact of our interventions as we move through a project. And at the end, we need to learn lessons. We need to evaluate. And there are perhaps persons, funding organizations, for example, or supporters to whom we're accountable. So we need to have this evidence to not only learn ourselves as organizations, but also to be able to demonstrate to those who have invested in us and in the work, to demonstrate to them that the goals, the aims have been achieved. We conduct welfare welfare assessments routinely in our populations. As a sanctuary organisation in the UK and Ireland, we have populations of donkeys kept on our own farms and premises. So we conduct these assessments routinely because we need to understand how good is the life experience for the animals that we hold ourselves in our direct care. So we conduct these as part of herd health assessments, and you might, as veterinarians in the audience, understand that these can often be focused on such as parasite control and injuries and wounds and hoof care, etc. And of course, as Ben has said, we will use these welfare assessments as part of our projects. We use trained personnel. It's very important to have people who can conduct the assessment. It is repeatable. So we want to minimize intra-operative variability and inter-operative variability so that we have some consistency across between operators, between assessors, and also so that if the same assessor repeats an assessment at another time, that the results are as near identical as possible. And we need to have the right tools, of course we do. Technology is really useful here. We're all learning, and this is a very good example today of how technology has stepped in to help us to conduct a conference because we're not able to physically be together for it. Health and safety, very important. And this animal in the slide may not look much of a threat, but of course, as Nat has already said, some of these animals have very well-developed defense mechanisms and may deploy them. So the safety of operators is important. And for us involved with projects, very often the owners or keepers of the animals are not ourselves. So we need to be very careful and show due respect for the owners and keepers of the animals. Prior to the assessment, making an evaluation of the location, the people involved. Very much as Ben has said, planning. What are we trying to achieve here? What kind of assessment? Why are we conducting these assessments? So the planning is vital, otherwise it's pretty much a meaningless exercise. And I've mentioned the owners, the keepers, and their consent to be involved in the process. So we must respect them. Set yourselves up for success. Don't do harm. Consider when it is appropriate to be involved and when it is sometimes discretion is the better part of valor, as they say, and sometimes it's important to step back and to say, you know what, it's another day. And Nat has mentioned these challenging behaviours. And one final piece here is just to be very careful, of course, about zoonotic disease. It's something that is very much in the public consciousness, of course, currently because of COVID-19 pandemic, but there are perhaps not such a problem with equines compared to some other species, but of course we have some zoonotic disease that might be transmissible to humans. So we have a tool that's been developed by the Donkey Sanctuary that is specific to our donkeys. And we need to be able to use this tool in a whole variety of settings, not only in our sanctuaries, in populations under our direct control, but of course in brick kilns, in production production farms in China, a whole variety of environments. Sometimes it's individual animals we're interested in, but of course, very often it's groups, it's larger populations. We want to gather data that we can use to, as Ben has said, to assess impact of our interventions. And we have a series of different protocols that we have developed as part of this EARS tool. Scientifically validated questions using consistent language with objective measures, and I've already mentioned the training of our assessors. So we now have 2 peer-reviewed publications. These are by my colleagues in the Donkey Sanctuary, and you will find a little bit more detail of this on my very last slide, these names and where to find these publications. The first one by Dr. Zoe Raw, who is the head of global research at the Donkey Sanctuary. Herself and colleagues have published this paper about the development of this tool, 19 welfare indicators, with its subdivision into 9 protocols then to be used in different situations for equines around the world. And they've conducted nearly 7,500 welfare assessments across 19 countries for this paper. And then another colleague of mine at the Donkey Sanctuary has further worked on this to aggregate our protocols and our welfare scores. So it's not just about, as many veterinarians, I was certainly conventionally trained to think much more about the physical and did not pay much attention to the emotional states of my patients, including equines. And so what is going through the heads of the minds of these donkeys as they work in an abattoir where their fellow species are being slaughtered? And qualitative behavioral assessment has given us a tool that is going to help us to understand more about the emotional states of these sentient beings, because it focuses on the whole animal. Now, the donkey suffers, if I can use that phrase, in that it is not such an emotive species as thoroughbreds, horses in particular, or many of the horses that we're used to dealing with as veterinarians. And so the donkey has, sometimes to its own detriment, developed a masking behavior. It camouflages its more extreme emotions. And this is a protective mechanism very often for the donkey, but for us as researchers or veterinarians, it means that we miss the more subtle signs. It means that we must develop better tools that are particularly attuned to the donkey, that allow us to understand what is the experience for that animal. So we need to use a scale that's particular to the donkey and not a scale that, for example, would be relevant to a thoroughbred horse. So the donkey, isn't just standing or isn't just walking or isn't just looking. The donkey, with some care and attention by ourselves, we can understand that the donkey is doing much more than that. They're standing or walking or looking in a particular kind of way with a certain type of expression, and this tells us much about the emotional state of that animal. So we've developed a tool, this EARS tool, assessment tool, using modern technology that's GPS located. We use tablets in the field, and we collect the data using these tablets and apps, as you might imagine. And so for the QBA part, we use an ODK app technology. I'm just thinking about this QBA part of it here for a second. This is a graph, and there were 4 quadrants here, and the 4 quadrants, it's quite simple, perhaps you might say, but low energy linked with a positive emotional state. What does that look like for a donkey? What does low energy with a negative emotional state, what does that look like for a donkey? And I'm going to show you in a moment. And then we have the 2 high energy quadrants. So sometimes you think about yourself, I'm energetic, I'm high energy, but I'm positive, I'm engaged, I'm enthusiastic, I want to be involved. And of course, there are other times in which our high energy is quite negative because we're stressed or perhaps overcome with stress and agitated and disturbed. And so high energy can be linked with a negative emotional state. Now, up to that point, I apologize about the delay at the beginning. That was my fault for not pushing the button. Up to that point, when I first saw this, and the first few times I saw this, I thought, well, this is a still picture. The donkey isn't moving because it's a still picture. That's why the donkey isn't moving. But it's not a still picture. It's a movie. And this donkey has very low energy and is in a negative emotional state. I think you'll agree. Now, is this a low energy or is it high energy? Of course, it's high energy. Then the question becomes, is this a high energy with a negative or with a positive emotional state? And I'll leave you to make this judgment. I'm just going to put up 4 short videos here in succession just to try and illustrate to you what the 4 quadrants of my graph were. And in the interest of time, just to move on to the next one. So again, the same question applies. Are you seeing low energy or are you seeing high energy? And if you're seeing high energy, which I think I am, then you have to think, well, what form of energy or emotion is being expressed here? Do you see contentment? Do you see happiness? Do you see playfulness? Or do you see negative states? Do you see aggression? Do you see response perhaps to noxious agent or invading species? And the last one. So I hope that you get a sense of calmness from this, a sense of that is low energy that you're looking at, but I think you also can get a sense that these are contented animals. These are relaxed, that these are comfortable in their environment, but still in noise. Sorry, my apologies. We don't need to have it again. So data interpretation, so what? Of course, we need robust analysis, we need robust data, but then we have to interpret it, we have to analyze it so that we have meaningful results. We need to make the process worthwhile for ourselves as project managers or welfare organizations, for the animals, because as Ben has already said, we need to understand the impact of the work that we do so that we can modify this, so that we can run better projects, so that we can spend our money and our energies more wisely. And of course, we want to see real benefits for the owners. For many of these animals, they are working equids living in close proximity to humans who depend on them very much for their livelihoods, as Daniela has already alluded to with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so we want to yield benefit for owners of animals as well as for themselves. Expert assistance, being open-minded. A negative result is as important as a positive. This is a criticism that's often been leveled at those using animals in research projects. So I'm talking about more laboratory research projects here, in that researchers have often historically been very reluctant to report negative results on the basis that a negative result was a failure. But we increasingly understand, and particularly in a laboratory animal environment, we need to understand when an experiment is being conducted, if a negative result ensues, we need to understand, and that needs to be publicized. Why? So that other researchers don't repeat the mistakes of the past. So it's very important that we identify negative results and that we're open and honest about those negative results, so that, as I said, it can be a learning experience. So in conclusion then, welfare assessments, if they're done well, help to give a voice to animals. They help us to understand what it is that's important to the animals, because we want to keep these equids at the core of the work that we do. And we want to improve their lives. We want to improve the impact of the interventions that we make now and into the future. So welfare assessments are an investment, and I do understand that for many of the smaller organizations or the less well-funded organizations often struggling to do the work, to do the job, this can seem like a step beyond them. It can seem like sometimes a waste of resources by some, because they feel that they don't have any spare resources, any spare, if you understand what I mean by spare, some additional people, some additional money, some additional time. But it is still really, really important that we understand that not to conduct the assessments means that we are sometimes blundering somewhat in the dark. The technology has really helped us. The technology assists us to do more work, to be more efficient, and very much to analyze the data better. So research provides evidence, and evidence is very important to us. And my colleagues and I at the Donkey Sanctuary are very pleased that we now have 2 peer-reviewed published papers that will help to validate this work, to allow us and others to have a better understanding of it. And we're going to continue to work on this to develop the tool, to adapt as we progress. And I want to say very much thank you to the World Veterinary Association for the invitation to be involved in this session. It's so important to us that we have an audience for equine welfare, people who understand the value of the work that we all do around the world. And I look forward to seeing many of you in person, if and when that should prove possible. Thank you, Roly.
Thank you very much. I am James, as have been introduced. I'm based in the East African office, and today I will be talking about the donkey hind crisis in East Africa, and I will take a little bit more time to share with the audience the impact of the trend on the donkeys and also the people that depend on them. So welcome. My presentation is divided into 7 parts, and I will be going through the background information for people to really understand how this trend looks like. And then I will also be sharing with people how donkeys are used in Africa. I will also share the donkey hind crisis itself, and then the impact of the same trend to the donkeys and also to the people that depend on them. And then some of the efforts or some of the things that Brooke has been doing to address this particular crisis. And then as I conclude, I will make a few recommendations. For those who are not very conversant with Africa, we, as a continent, we have 54 countries, and 10 of these countries are in East Africa. And then we have about 1.3 billion people, with an estimated population of donkeys to be around 13 million. So this particular animal that we are calling the donkey is the only livestock that we actually say can truly be traced to Africa. And therefore, in all the activities and things that people do here in Africa, you will actually see that the donkey will be embedded in their livelihoods. Donkeys, as many of you will probably know, they are actually invisible but very silent workers. Because, for example, in Africa, donkeys, no one would even dare put a price on a donkey. They were just given out to people who actually need them, and they were never sold. And it is the only animal, when it dies in Africa, people actually mourn, just the way they mourn when human beings die, because they consider this animal to be a family friend. So, of the 54 countries in Africa, it's only Kenya where donkeys are actually categorized as meat animals. And this was actually done in 1999 via Gazette Notice number 146. That is what led to the establishment of 4 slaughterhouses in Kenya, with about 17 companies licensed to export the donkey skin. And when you look at all that scenario, then Kenya became the epicenter of the donkey hind trade crisis. And actually, until recently, 10 days ago, when the government actually banned this particular trade. And just a little bit of the background is that when you look at the Chinese economy, many people have been moving from the low class to the middle class. And that has made many people in China, for example, to abandon farming to settle in towns. And everybody knows that the middle class people actually want to live like the very rich. Sometimes they can't afford, but they really want to do it. So, and in China, there is a traditional medicine that has for a very long time been used by the very rich called a jiao, which is actually a gelatinous extraction from the donkey skin. And they believe, though there is no scientific evidence, that it can produce aphrodisiac kind of substances that can enhance not only sex, but also beauty. And now, because many people are moving to the middle class, actually they are putting a very big demand on this particular product. And when that demand increases in China, it is also putting the global donkey population at a very big risk, of course, threatening livelihoods of millions of people that actually depend on those particular animals. Let me turn my slides to how we use donkeys in Africa. And for example, donkeys are actually used in household chores, like for example, fetching water and firewood. And that actually saves millions of shillings for any particular household. And 75% of, for example, East Africa is arid and semi-arid, and therefore pastoralism is a way of life, still a way of life. And therefore pastoralists, when they move or they migrate from one place to the other, they actually use donkeys. Donkeys are also used in income generation. For example, they are used in construction. They are also used in agriculture. They provide not only employment, but also food. And last year, we carried out, at the Brook East Africa, we carried out a study, and we were able to establish that on average, each donkey would earn like 114 US dollars in a month. And therefore, if you look at that, it is able not only to address the Sustainable Development Goal number 1, it also addresses goal number 2 of zero hunger. Donkeys, believe you me, if you look at the picture on my right, you will actually see a young girl trekking for a very long distance in a very arid area fetching water, like a 5 jerrycan. So families without donkeys, they are not able to keep their children in school. Because if a donkey doesn't do the work, then the child will actually do the work. And if the child doesn't do the work, then the mother probably will do the work. So we've also been able to see that families with donkeys are able to keep their children in school. Therefore, also addressing Sustainable Development Goal number 4. And many of the work that the donkey will do is actually what culturally falls under the women realm. And therefore, when women have the donkeys, then they are able to help them do the work better. And more importantly, this is the only animal in Africa that a woman is around to own, to use, and to do anything that they want with the same animal. And therefore, when you look at it, it is in one way or the other addressing gender equality, which is a sustainable goal number 8. Sorry, and because I said East Africa is basically 70% semi-arid, then water is a big problem. And therefore, East Africa is actually classified as a water scarce region. And you will actually realize donkeys do the bulk of carrying of the water, both in urban and also in rural areas. And you can actually see from the photo on my left-hand side that all those containers will eventually be carried by the donkeys to their respective homes. So in one way or the other, it also addresses sustainable goal number 6. And recently, last year, Brook East Africa carried out a study in urban areas, and we were able to establish that donkeys directly employ over 40,000 youths. Actually, more than any blue chip company in East Africa, and therefore providing decent work and also spurring economic growth in East Africa. So donkeys also play a major role in, especially in Africa and in arid areas, in provision of livestock relief emergency. And if you ever land in Kenya, most likely in any hotel, you will take milk that has been transported by a donkey from the source to wherever the processing is actually done, and therefore adding value to the milk chain. And finally, in Africa, especially in arid and semi-arid areas, donkeys actually play a key role in resilience building. And as many people have been saying, we also think it contributes to climate action because it provides renewable energy and does not emit even a single carbon to the environment. Sorry, I should have warned my viewers that I have a slide that is a bit graphic here because I want to talk about the crisis now. And the donkey slaughter is actually either carried in the bush or in a slaughterhouse. So the only interest is to harvest the skin, as you can see on that photo. And then that skin is carried to China. It is then processed, and then it produces ijao that you can see on the right-hand side, which then is consumed by whoever wants to consume it for the aphrodisiac kind of benefits that they purport to have. So the situation in East Africa is that, for example, citing only 3 countries, is that, for example, Tanzania, which has about 1 million donkeys with 2 slaughterhouses, and they've only been around to slaughter 40 donkeys per day, there still exists a rampant theft of donkeys, and then those donkeys are transported to Kenya because I said Kenya is actually the epicenter. And recently we've been told that one slaughterhouse has been closed, whether due to wrangles or whether they are not making profit, we are not very sure. Another example that I can cite is Ethiopia. Ethiopia has the highest equine population in the world, about 11 million or thereabout. And culturally, donkeys are not acceptable to be slaughtered in Ethiopia. And actually, the largest number of donkeys that are slaughtered in Kenya, they come from Ethiopia. So at any given day, you will see so many donkeys smuggled to Kenya for slaughter. And in 2012, the Chinese established a donkey slaughter in a place called Debrazit, and then the population decided they would just set it into fire, so they were able to burn it. Focusing now into Kenya, in 2009, Kenya had a donkey population of about 1.8 million. At the moment, last year we carried out the census, and the estimates are that we now have 600,000 donkeys. And because of the legal notice that I indicated, we have four operational donkey slaughterhouses in Kenya that cumulatively slaughter over 1,200 donkeys in a day. That's a huge number. And with 17 licensed companies to export the donkey skin. Actually, last year, Kenya and China signed a bilateral kind of a trade where they supported the thriving of this particular business, and therefore fueling the smuggling of donkeys from other neighboring countries into Kenya. And so you can see it's a complex kind of a trade that is really threatening these particular animals. Now, quickly, let me run through the impact of this trade to the donkeys. Last year we carried out a study, and we were able to realize that there is a serious welfare violation of the donkeys during transportation. For example, we were able to establish that 10% of these particular donkeys actually suffer bites, wounds, broken bones, and some of them actually die while on transit, as you can see on the photo. And courtesy of the donkey sanctuary, I was able to pick this photo, but this is a scenario that you see in all the market correction points. And we were able to actually establish that there are no welfare provisions. So there are no water is provided, no shelter, no feeds. And upon talking to numerous marketers or numerous middlemen, they were able to tell us that they starve donkeys because they believe it is easier to remove their skin when they are thin. That's a serious kind of a thing. Allow me to jump into this particular short 25 minutes screen video, and then you will be able to see what really happens to the donkeys when they are being taken into a slaughterhouse. And you will actually realize the kind of psychological trauma that these particular animals undergo when they are just driven into a slaughterhouse. We are waiting for the video to open, please. Thank you very much. I'll just put it off at that point and proceed with my presentation. And my colleague later on in the panel discussion will be able to share much more of what these donkeys go through in the slaughterhouse. So the other impact that we see in donkeys is that the few donkeys that actually remain in communities, they even suffer more because people share them and then they carry even the road that has been left behind by the slaughtered animals. And therefore, when you look at that keenly, it causes a lot of psychological stress to these particular animals. There's a lot of pain. They become too exhausted and then they inflicted wounds, and also they increase the risk of injuries even during work. There is also a theory that with time, donkeys actually might become extinct. For example, Kenya Agricultural and Livestock Research Organization in Kenya last year carried out a research, and they were able to tell us that Kenya is slaughtering 5.1% of their donkeys against a reproduction rate of 1.05, which technically means that in the next 3 years, we will have no single donkey. And figures can be able to explain this better. In 2009, Kenya had a population of 1.8 million. Last year, the estimates are 600. And even borrowing from what I got from Donkey Sanctuary here, in China, in 1992, they had 11 million donkeys. In 2017, they only had 4.6 million donkeys. And there are also concerns that there is a biosecurity concern or risks, because when you look at the whole value chain, it predisposes many either animals and also humans to the spread of either zoonotic or even contagious diseases, like the equine influenza that we witnessed in 2018 in West Africa. So turning on now to the impact of this particular trend to people who depend on them, we realize that donkeys are major part of, they form major part of the working livestock, and therefore they support millions of people, especially in developing countries. They actually provide directly the power, the income, and also save time and money for transporting goods. Additionally, working donkeys also provide a vital resilience building mechanism, and therefore the shock of anyone losing a donkey can actually destroy that person's livelihood and push them into poverty. It's like an accountant losing a job overnight. So it's as serious as that. And a paper published by Kanda G and others in last year, we were able to see that, for example, 15% of children were able to start missing school when their donkeys is either stolen or slaughtered. And 35% of women, actually their labor started increasing from what they were doing, and a whooping 78% of donkey owners actually became poorer. And then they made a conclusion that when donkeys are either not there or they are stolen, 3 categories of people suffer most: women, children, and also the elderly. And that has a great impact on their health and also their general well-being. So we've also witnessed a little bit of animals moving, especially from Somalia and those other places, and that has also caused some conflict between the two countries. You can actually see my colleague Laura picked that photo when she met those animals moving because of a conflict. And in conclusion, we say that when donkeys are stolen or actually slaughtered, women overwork. So family quality time is compromised, and that can actually lead to serious disputes, family separation, and we've also witnessed in East Africa divorce and total family breakdown. That's how serious this trend crisis can be. Brook East Africa has been having 5 main pillars of how to address this particular crisis, and these pillars are partnership. We've been forming alliances with owners and also other like-minded organizations just to champion this. We've also been spearheading protection, where we encourage communities to actually protect their own animals. And we've also been trying to provide evidence, like, for example, we've carried out 4 studies within 2 years, and we've been participating in creating awareness, like for example in community actions. We also were able to hold a big donkey conference in East Africa, and we've also been doing a lot of media campaign, and we've also participated in livestock policy drafting. We've also encouraged communities to do petitions, and we've actually done like 5 or so petitions. And recently we also had a question in Parliament. So these 5 pillars have been helping the Brook East Africa to speak roundly against the donkey hide crisis. And to conclude on this, you can see 2 photos here. The one on the right, this particular donkey was picked from a slaughterhouse. It belonged to one of the old ladies there, and they complained a lot. And then the one on the left-hand side, the man in blue, is actually the cabinet secretary for agriculture in Kenya. And this particular day, because of the community action, he was able to make a pronouncement that he will actually ban the donkey trade in Kenya. And indeed, by Gazette notice of 20th April, which is last week but one, legal notice number 63, he was able to revoke the license of the 4 slaughterhouses in Kenya, and that made Kenya join dozens of other countries in Africa that have actually banned this particular trade. And those were actually very good news for us. To conclude my presentation, this particular trend has devastating effects on both the animal and also the people that actually depend on them. So therefore, global collaboration is actually needed to initiate the discussion so that we can completely ban this particular trade. And we've proposed a few things that each of the stakeholders can actually do. The first stakeholder that is very essential here is the owner. We are encouraging the owners to protect their donkeys against this particular trade. We are also asking the researchers to develop evidence that can inform policy and also facilitate the global conversation of the same issue. The non-governmental organizations can actually empower owners and raise awareness both nationally and even globally. Policymakers in both countries where the trend exists and those countries where the trend probably will come in future, we are asking them to start registering on the donkey hide trade and also to develop policy that can strengthen local community resilience. And for many of my listeners today have, we are asking them to provide evidence, to create awareness, and to also support the ban against the international trend on donkey hide. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining for this session. As Rolly says, my job for the next 20 minutes is to tell you how funding of scientific research by the Horse Trust, which is a UK-based equine NGO, has had impact on equine welfare and improved equine well-being. I'd like to spend just 3 slides and give you a little bit of background to the Horse Trust before I talk about the work that the Horse Trust has funded. The charity was funded back in 1886 by Anne Lindo, who'd been touched by Anna Sewell's book, Black Beauty, which had been published a few years before in 1877. Back in Victorian times, of course, London moved by horse, and there are around about 500,000 working horses on the capital streets, with a life expectancy of just 5 years once they entered work. And Anne Lindo's vision was to give respite to working horses, mainly cab horses like the horse on the right, and give the cabbies a replacement horse until their own horse was recuperated and could return to work. The charity started to provide rest, respite and retirement to military horses after the First World War, and today provides rest, respite and retirement to 140 military, police and riding for the disabled horses, the UK's equine civil servants. And in addition to its sanctuary mission, which like all of the UK equine welfare charities includes humanitarian welfare rescue cases, the Horse Trust is one of the UK's major funding agencies for equine scientific research, funding between £1.5 and £2 million of project grants and PhD studentships each year to support non-invasive research into equine well-being. Our focus is quality of life, and we take a holistic view of the impact of equine disease, equine behaviour, and human decision-making on equine well-being. So what I'm going to do is pick out some of the sustained research themes and some of the current projects which the Horse Trust is funding, and give you a sense of some of the outputs from those and the impacts that they've had on equine well-being. So I'm going to start with Strangles, and the Horse Trust has had a sustained funding programme into Strangles research over the last 20 years or so, principally at the Animal Health Trust with Dr. Andrew Waller and Dr. Richard Newton and their colleagues. And over that time, there have been significant scientific outputs which have had real impacts on equine well-being. And from all of the work that has occurred in the Strangles area, I've picked 3 examples: genome research, development of a diagnostic blood test, and molecular epidemiology and surveillance. The Horse Trust funded sequencing of the strep equigenome right at the start of this of the Strangles programme, and this was the first purely veterinary pathogen to have its genome sequenced. And this opened up a rich seam of discovery, including developing the Strangles blood test and also the ability to conduct molecular epidemiology, which I'll talk about in the next 2 slides. And these 2 rather beautiful diagrams are portraits of 2 pathogens, strep equi on the left and strep zooepidemicus on the right. And the genome map showed that contrary to what we'd believed for decades, strep equi is actually derived from strep zooepidemicus and not the other way around. And is in fact a high virulence version of strep zooepidemicus with its larger genome due to the insertion of 177 extra genes, many of these virulent genes, by bacteriophages, transposons, and other mobile genetic elements. And the insertion of these genes into regions of the genome inactivated some existing genes, mainly those for host range, which is why strep equi is a narrow host range pathogen and strep zooepidemicus is a broad host range pathogen. Dr. Waller and colleagues used the this genetic information to identify proteins of strep equi that are seen by the horse's immune system, and used this information to devise a highly sensitive and specific blood test for exposure to Strangles, which has become the mainstay of Strangles controlled programs, and in fact is the most commonly performed equine infectious disease diagnostic test that the Animal Health Trust performs. And one of the ways which the team at the HT have been able to translate this into impact on the ground is this really excellent cartoon, which I'll quickly run through now, which shows how control programs for Strangles can be constructed. And this cartoon's been widely used for both veterinary and horse owner audiences, and it describes the construction of your high risk or red zone, the isolation area for those animals with clinical signs, a yellow zone, an amber zone for those healthy, apparently healthy but in contact animals, and then in some cases construction of a green or no contact zone for animals which are believed to have had no contact with either the amber or the red groups. Movement of people is from green to amber, then amber to red, and simple ideas like color coding buckets and equipment with colored tape to show the green, amber and red zones and stop people moving equipment between those zones is a very simple practical tip to help manage those areas. We need to take temperatures twice daily and be ready to move animals between those groups if they show any clinical signs, which is often in outbreaks just a single temperature spike. And so this character in the amber zone has developed fever, and he moves over to the red zone. And here's where the Strangles blood test comes in, used at the end of the outbreak to screen animals in the amber and the green groups for exposure, which then allows detailed investigation of those animals as potential carriers. The third area that's come out of that original genome research has been the ability to do molecular epidemiology. And a major discovery was that for decades, we'd all thought that Strep epi was a highly unusual streptococcus, which was exactly the same worldwide. In other words, it was a global clone. Now, this would have been highly unusual amongst bacteria. And in fact, this was not the case. And the genome information showed that actually there are many different strains of Strep equi based on one of the surface proteins called M protein. And Dr. Waller's work allowed genetic strain typing to be developed. And the diagram on the left is an early example of how this can be used to identify the genetic relatedness of different strains and then to cluster them into different relatedness groupings. And for clarity, these have been grouped into different coloured circles. And the UK maps on the right there show the spread of those different strain types across the UK between 2007 and 2008. And in fact, one of those strain types, sequence type 51, has gone on to spread almost worldwide in the 12 or so years since that work was done. So this has added a whole new dimension to what we can do with understanding the Strangles bug and how it moves. And this has all come together in a surveillance project which started in the UK and is now an international surveillance program for Strangles called Surveillance of Equine Strangles. And this collates laboratory diagnostic information along with clinical data and also biobanks of bacterial isolates, which allows things like movement of individual strains across individual regions of a country, a whole country, or internationally to be followed. And the SES, Surveillance of Equine Strangles website, has monthly updates. I've got a screen grab of the update, which was the summary of Q4 of last year, which updates everyone with information about disease prevalence, what's going on out there in the UK, and this project, as I say, is moving to an international focus in its current second phase. So that's Strangles. The next related project I'd like to show is biosecurity, and this is from Dr. Joe Ireland, who's currently at the University of Liverpool. And the aim of this project was to assess biosecurity practices and attitudes to biosecurity in the leisure horse sector. And this project was carried out using surveys, site visits, and semi-structured interviews, and has provided some important insights into biosecurity in the leisure horse sector, as well as a real wake-up call for us vets, which I'll show at the end of this section. Some of the highlights for me was that although most owners were familiar with the term biosecurity, many thought this was a very negative term, and I think there's an important message for us here when we're communicating biosecurity. If people see it as a negative term, they're less likely to want to engage with it. Interestingly, although most owners are very worried about infectious diseases like Strangles, most thought that their own horse was at very low or absent risk of developing infectious disease. And clearly work to do with isolation facilities. Many sites don't have isolation facilities, and almost none of the sites visited had protocols or had anyone who'd been trained to operate isolation appropriately. And here is the wake-up call for vets. Most owners said that they would like to go to their vets for information on biosecurity, but noted that few of their vets talked about biosecurity and said that generally they're not seeing examples of good biosecurity from their vets. And the quotes in the two dialogue boxes there, I think, are quite telling. And if vets aren't washing their hands or following basic biosecurity protocols, it's clearly very difficult for very difficult for us to influence the behaviour of others. I'm going to move on now to another sustained area of funding for the horse trust, which has been into the area of small strong isle or cyathostomin control, resistance, and responsible use of antibiotics to spread the slough of this resistance. And this work is all from the Modern Institute, initially with Professor Jackie Matthews and now with Dr. Stuart Burgess. And there's been a lot of work come out of that, including understanding of resistance mechanisms. This particular work has been the latest phase in this, which was to develop a blood test to test for exposure to cytostomins, which would then guide those animals which need to be treated. Now, we only fund non-invasive research, but where archive samples exist from previous studies which have been carried out elsewhere, and where these samples can be used to good use to move our research along, then we think it's sensible to maximise the benefit of those archive samples. And this is an example of this. This work was done using an archive of serum samples from a project that had been done some years ago in the USA. And the group in Scotland had the opportunity to use those blood samples and could see the opportunity to develop a blood test from this. So they screened a large number of cytostomin surface proteins for antigenicity in horse serum and identified a panel of 3 antigens which are used as the basis for a triple antigen ELISA test to detect exposure to cytostomins. And this was validated against the serum from the historical experimental study which had been carried out in the USA. And this has now gone on to become a commercial test which was released in the UK last year. So change of topic now and move on to something which is a major problem in all types of horses, ponies and donkeys, which is obesity. And this is a project from Dr. Judith Pinchbeck and Tamsin Furtado in the University of Liverpool. And they wanted to investigate some of the well-known issues around the way people think about obesity in their animals, in particular that there's great confusion about the ideal condition for equines. And many leisure horse owners think that weight control is too difficult, or they feel bad in restricting what their animal eats. So this was a qualitative research project using information from a variety of discussion fora. It used interviews and focus groups to understand how owners perceive weight, how they manage it, and what their attitudes are to obesity. And many owners found it hard to recognise the correct weight. They don't recognise images of animals which are at the appropriate weight. And most owners really didn't know how best to address weight control and what they could do with their own animal. And the research concluded that in the UK, all equids are in a uniquely obesogenic environment. That's a great phrase that the researchers used. What they mean by that is that the effects of climate change, the relative lack of exercise that most leisure owners experience, combined with a range of restrictions on turnout and activity in livery yards, means that equids are really likely to put on weight because of that combination of factors. And to help with this, the groups produced this really useful online tool which helps owners assess the condition of their animal, its fatness, and then look at what they're doing, look at their management, ask what can you change, and then what are you going to change, and come up with an action plan for this. And this has been a really useful tool that's had impact for owners. And something that's been really useful on the ground is a very simple idea, and this is, I think, a great example of how the simple ideas are often the best ideas, which was to award rosettes at shows for the healthiest weight. And the simple idea here is that this would reward those owners and their animals which are at the healthiest weight, and really addresses the issue that frequently horses and ponies which are overweight, or cresty as people often say, are celebrated by both judges and contestants for their condition. What this initiative does is reward those animals which are in healthy condition. It's had great uptake, and I think is really making people think about weight and what that looks like. 2 projects to go. This is a project which is in progress at the moment, and I've included it because it will be relevant for our panel discussion, and I think speaks partly to Joe's QBA assessments, which he was talking about in his last talk. So this is a project from Dr. Rebecca Smith and Dr. Gina Pinchbeck at the University of Liverpool. It's in its early stages, and I've included it because it's a good example of how holistic research approaches are needed to understand quality of life. In this case, how human decision-making impacts on quality of life for the older horse. The project is testing the hypothesis that previous experience of owners and vets, combined almost certainly with both conscious and subconscious bias, impacts on a wide range of decision-makings for older horses, including management decisions, whether preventive healthcare is provided, whether they receive treatment, and how euthanasia decisions are made. And again, this is qualitative research using data from discussion fora, in-depth interviews with owners, as well as interviews with vets. And the goal here is to understand the factors that influence the complex decision-making around management of older horses, and to help owners and vets make better and more appropriate decisions. And then finally, on to a project from Dr. Doug Wilson at the University of Bristol into insect bite hypersensitivity, or sweet itch, and a project with the goal of coming up with an alternative treatment to the ones we have currently available, which is immunotherapy or hyposensitization. And Doug has dissected thousands of mid-salivary glands and has identified and sequenced a number of proteins that allergens and cause sweet itch. And from this, he's identified a number of candidate proteins which appear to act as primary allergens and could be the basis for a vaccine to desensitize animals which are affected by this. And the idea is that a course of vaccines at the appropriate dose would then desensitize susceptible animals so they either don't react or react less severely to midge bites. And I really like this photo. Doug reports he's using oral vaccination, so the protein vaccine is in a peppermint gel which contains the candidate proteins, and he reports no problems in getting his test ponies to accept the vaccine. And then the last slide, the Horse Trust is embarking on the first long-term large-scale cohort study in horses, and is about to start funding a project called Horse Life, which will follow a target of 10,000 horses and ponies and donkeys over 10 years, collecting management, disease, behaviour and genetic information, as well as biobank samples, which will form a unique resource and we hope a research platform for years to come into a whole range of projects relating to clinical disease, behaviour, human decision making, and how all those all come together to impact on quality of life. Well, Rowley, ladies and gentlemen, that's my time up. Thank you very much for listening.
Anthony, thank you very much indeed. And my presentation this evening is going to pick up on quite a lot of what we've talked about this evening, start with Nat and all the way through to what Alana has been talking about, and to introduce the concept of social license. And in doing that, I just firstly wanted to set the context before introducing the concept, and then just look at some practical implications, both for veterinarians and those working in animal health and welfare spheres, but also then to talk a little bit about how we communicate about welfare, especially around horse sport, before making some concluding comments. So, I mean, I don't need to say anyone on the webinar this evening or this morning to say that we live in very changing times. And as Alana has picked up, you know, the public's views on the use of horses in sport, or indeed any use of horses, is evolving. And whilst we've always had a partnership with horses over the millennia in various different spheres, there's an increasing number of people who believe that using horses for sport and leisure is exploitation. And whereas many would say use but not abuse, an increasing number are saying any use of horses is abuse. And this is very much a global phenomenon. You don't have to look at whether in Australia, in the US, in the UK, across Europe. But what happens, and these disasters and scandals, like the example here is the TV program, ABC program, that hit the headlines last October in Australia of racehorses going to the slaughterhouse, has an impact globally. Because horse ownership is, as I've said, on this ethical tightrope. And the challenge we have is that you've got public perception versus reality. And with the evolvement of social media, it can be hugely frustrating when actually public perception through social media is so divorced from reality. But what we can't do is simply ignore it and say the public is wrong. So again, you look at headlines across the world, various different Olympic disciplines, racing. It's not many weeks go by when a scandal hits the headlines. But it's not just horse sport that is impacted about this, because we increasingly see headlines that is questioning the very use of horses, the very riding of horses, and indeed the use of horses in a very increasingly popular area for therapy for people with challenges, both behavioural and medical. So we do live in very much a changing world. So set against that changing world, we also live in a changing understanding of equine welfare. And this has very much been picked up in a number of the presentations we've already heard today. What do we mean by good welfare? Well, I think the really important thing to understand, it's all about physical and mental health. And as David Meller says, it's all about giving the animals the opportunity to thrive. So picking up on Joe and others' point, it's not just giving them a life worth living, it is giving them a good life. And that's why the 5 freedoms, which have been with us since the 1960s, have very much and have done an amazing job of improving animal welfare across the globe, have very much passed their sell-by date now, because it's not just about simply protecting animals from negative experiences. You've seen these slides already this evening, and where the 5 domains have moved on, sorry, the 5 freedoms very much have moved on to the 5 domains, where we recognize horses as sentient beings, and where quality of life is based on at least a life worth living, actually a good life, and where mental well-being, the mental state in this particular diagram here, around from good nutrition, good health, good behavior, and good environment, actually feeds in to a positive mental state for that animal. And you can look at this in a different way, where people often now talk about the 3 Fs, giving the equines the freedom, remembering where they've come from over evolutionary times, the fact that they are herd animals grazing the pastures and grading the plains and moving a lot. They eat 17 hours a day. They will graze 17 hours a day. And as I say, they are herd animals, and those friendships that they build up are very, very important to their mental well-being. So when we look at all of that, I think we've just got to challenge ourselves. Have we got the right balance between meeting the mental needs of our horses as well as their physical needs? And as the world we're in changes, and as our understanding of equine welfare changes, that by definition means that we have to challenge the way we are doing things today. Just because we've managed our horses in a particular way for many, many decades doesn't mean it's right. And Nat and Josh have already talked to us about the investment in research to understand about equine mental well-being. And there is so much more to do here, because not least, the public have expectations that if we are going to benefit from horses, then we are going to do all we can to support their health and their welfare. So that's where the concept of social license comes in. It's nothing new. It's been around for over 200 years. And more recently, it's been used with in the environmental world, where mining industries in the 1990s recognized that there was growing disquiet about the environmental impact that mining had on the world, but also the fact that they were putting people at risk by sending them underground into mines. And so they recognized that they had to invest in their social license. What is it? It's an unwritten, non-legally binding contract. And it's all about transparency. It's all about doing the right thing by our horses, but also telling people that we are doing the right thing. And one thing that I'd love to stress here is this is not about mob rule. You often hear people in horse sport say the public, through social media campaigns, on whatever it be, is trying to dictate what we do. No, they are not trying to dictate what we do, but we ignore what the public think at our peril. So here, the idea is obviously to move from top left to bottom right. And I think it's a bit of a stretch to think that horse sport will ever get to psychological identification where there's complete trust with the community. But too often, the horse sport social license is acceptance, sometimes bordering on being withdrawn, as opposed to where horse sport is approved and has the support of the general public. And at the heart of the social license is something that Alana has already talked to us about, the horse-human partnership, where this defines responsible use. What does it require? It requires obviously knowledge and experience, but also compassion. And without a doubt, this leads to better short-term success, not least in competition, but also in the long-term prognosis for these animals and their future career options. And the horse-human partnership, most importantly, forms the basis of how we should be communicating about that horse sport narrative to the general public. So very briefly, what does this mean for vets? We recognise this is figures from the UK, but vets remain a very highly trusted source of information and guidance. Yes, we have great competition from Dr. Google and others, but we are still in a great position to be able to inform owners about their responsibilities and also reflect on our own. And one way we need to be doing that is very much keeping abreast of the latest research. And as I said before, we have to challenge the way we are doing things. It might seem strange to introduce the whip here, but I think the whip is a very good illustration of what we mean by social license, because the public do not like the whip. Research across the globe tells us that. But many, and we would agree, that the use of the whip is often not a welfare issue. It can be a welfare issue, but it's often not. But the public don't like it. They believe it's cruel. So can we ever convince the public that using the whip for encouragement, for example, in racing, can ever be justified? But it's not just a racing issue. We have seen headlines in other sports where over the use of the whip has done significant damage to the reputation of sport. We've already heard this evening about equine obesity, and vets have a really important role to play here, because we know research tells us that fat is not fabulous for horse health, quite the opposite. And indeed in the UK, we believe it's the most significant equine health and welfare challenge facing. So these conversations are very difficult with owners, because often the owners are trying to do the right thing. They want to give their horse extra treats. They want to rug their horse. But what they're doing is actually to the detriment of the horse. And indeed, rider weight is becoming a big, big challenge, forgive the pun. The Great Yorkshire Show has introduced where the vet, before riders go in their showing classes, they have to pass a vetting, which includes an assessment of rider weight to the animal they're riding. And they've actually eliminated some competitors because they believed they were mismatched to their horses. When we talk about rider weight. We are not talking about stopping people riding. We are making sure, or trying to make sure, they are riding the right type of horse, because again, the public very much sees this as cruelty. I think for vets, this is probably the nub of what we're talking about, because if we are honest with ourselves, too many treatments and interventions today are now considered routine. The use of Gastrogard, routine wind operations in racehorses, or indeed in racehorses and sport horses, medicating joints as a standard. But this is not about treating conditions. We must do more about preventing them. And that's why the balance of the relationship between vet and trainer and owner is such an important one. And we have a real responsibility to speak up for equine health and equine welfare, because we need to be able to ethically justify the interventions we're undertaking to make sure that we really are protecting horse health and welfare and not exploiting it. And then very briefly, this is the heart of what we talk about, the communication. When I said about social license, it's about doing the right thing with our horses, but telling people. When we talk about the responsible use of horses, use is a one-way term. We make it two-way through the partnership, through making it an ethical basis for all horse sport. And that's about a balanced relationship, about teamwork and not exploitation, about treating every horse as an individual. But I also think it's about looking at a horse sport through a different lens, through a lens that the general public will look. And so when we hear, for example, in horse racing, the excellent work that is done to reduce fatalities and catastrophic injuries on the racecourse, that work is so important, but it's somewhat perverse to be justifying our sports to the general public by saying we killed less horses this year than we did last. So where do we go next? I think we've got to really recognise the importance of social licence, of what it means for the future health of horse sport and the health and welfare of the equine participants. And it really is a collective responsibility. We need to develop a better understanding about what the true benefits are through horses and their interaction with us. As I mentioned several times, we have to challenge the status quo, and we need to evolve how we communicate around horse sport. There's a number of references I've put up here, but there's many others that we can talk about separately. And I just want to say thank you very much for listening to me. But of course, actions are always going to speak louder than words. So I'm delighted that Martin Burns, who works for New Zealand Thoroughbred Racing as General Manager for Racing and Equine Welfare, is going to talk to us this evening about social licence and what New Zealand Racing has done, and about how they developed the Thoroughbred welfare assessment guidelines and what the New Zealand experience has been. So I'm now going to hand over to Martin.
Yes, thanks very much, and thanks for the introduction. Today I'll take you through some important aspects of NZTR's Thoroughbred Welfare Program. For those that probably don't know, NZTR is the governing body for thoroughbred racing and breeding in New Zealand. My presentation will follow the structure shown, which largely reflects the sequence of work NZTR has undertaken over the past 3 years. The recognition of the concept of social licence and ensuring racing's future legitimacy and relevance were a cornerstone of NZTR's initial review of thoroughbred welfare in 2017. And our recognition of the broad utility of the 5 domains model as a basis for welfare standards and enforcement. These topics are highlighted as components of the broad approach to better ensuring the welfare of thoroughbreds in New Zealand, as shown on this slide. Headline grabs such as these are effective in awakening racing participants to the effects of bad news and eroding public confidence and trust in racing. These are obviously very negative, being a loss of public support, which in turn leads to a loss of political support, and fewer owners with an open mind to future participation as sponsors, attendees, or as owners of racehorses. It's fair to say that recognition of the concept and the vital importance of maintaining social licence has become far more widespread in the New Zealand racing industry over the past 4 years. With recognition of social licence as a term with relevance to racing, it has been useful to give the term some structure and purpose. I found the framework for social licence, as explained by Thompson and Boutier, to be an effective tool in building understanding and, importantly, in ensuring broad industry support for various horse welfare initiatives. This model has the same components as Rolly described in his prior presentation. In our context, the key tenets in this are that to ensure the future sustainability and vibrance of racing in New Zealand, that NZTR, industry bodies and participants must work together to defend the legitimacy of racing, while seeking or maintaining racing's credibility in the minds of the general public. There are many aspects involved in this, but the ethical and humane treatment of our horses is critical. It is also vital in building trust to be transparent and accountable to public and government. I'll now move on to the basis and development of NZTR's welfare assessment guidelines. It's interesting to briefly note that animal sentience is defined in legislation in New Zealand. How this impacts interpretation of law is yet to be tested or resolved in our courts. Regardless, from NZTR's viewpoint, we endorse the concept of sentience in horses as self-evident, and this is acknowledged in our guidelines. A horse's expressiveness of its mood and health is to its advantage in reinforcing the horse-human bond and for ensuring our better care for their needs. Another foundation stone is a vision for thoroughbred welfare, as shown. This is anchored on modern animal welfare concepts. That is, a good life as the ideal that requires the horse's positive experiences to outweigh occasional compromises across its lifetime. Anyone involved in racing recognises that a horse's welfare and its peak athletic performance are closely connected. High welfare standards benefit both the individual horse as well as the industry's social licence. Clearly described guidelines achieve dual purposes of describing standards against which persons involved in the care of thoroughbreds may be held accountable, and secondly, in providing public and media with an understanding of the expectations for the care of thoroughbreds. People close to racing will understand that high standards of husbandry and veterinary care for our horses is a cultural norm. Meeting higher welfare standards for our horses also enhances the psychological well-being of those amongst us that work in thoroughbred racing or just enjoy racing as a sport. With all this in mind, a need emerged for a structured way of defining and communicating the high welfare standards required. We were very fortunate that in 2017, while preparing NZTR's initial review of thoroughbred welfare, that I was introduced to Professor David Mellor, who was one of the external experts who critiqued the NZTR review. Together, we quickly concluded that it would be appropriate and practical to adopt the 5 domains model as the basis for thoroughbred welfare guidelines. Whilst thoroughbreds are high-value animals that are trained as elite athletes, there are some compromises on the horse's welfare. The 5 domains welfare framework acknowledges that, on balance and across the 5 welfare aims and provisions, the horse can and must be provided with a life worth living, or in fact, beyond that, a good life. The process of developing the guidelines was what seemed at the time a lengthy 18-month process. However, looking back, the time spent was very productive. While a core working group was key to the development and informing a structure for the guidelines and in debating required standards, we were also mindful to provide opportunity for broad consultation both within and external to the racing industry. This slide describes the general outline of the 5 domains model, which are both an evolution of the 5 freedoms and the basis for NZTR's guidelines. The first 3 domains of the model, nutrition, environment, and health, focus on the key elements of the physical functioning of the horse, elements essential for its survival. Good husbandry, required veterinary care, and appropriate enclosures are measures that help meet the horse's innate needs. The 4th domain, behaviour, focuses on the extent to which the horse can express agency or its self-will. Key provisions for this domain can be met by providing opportunities for rewarding behaviours. For example, company of other horses, play, mutual grooming, or seeking sun or shade. The 5th domain, the mental state of the thoroughbred, focuses attention on negative and positive subjective experiences, or effects. There are 2 main types. Firstly, the horse's wellness, generated by its nutrition, environment, and health domains. And secondly, the horse's ability to fulfill rewarding behaviours. Thus, the first 4 domains all focus attention on situations that contribute not negative and positive experiences, which are accumulated for consideration in its 5th, mental domain. So explained, a key task was adapting a general 5 domains model, non-specific to species, to be a model relevant specifically to thoroughbreds in the New Zealand context. We also worked to give recognition to the changing welfare needs or experiences according to a horse's life stages, before, during, and after racing. It's whether as a foal or juvenile, as a racehorse, in breeding stock, or its post-racing second career. A small yet well-composed working group ensured that relevant issues were identified and were described in a language suited to our local participants. In addition to the provisions and welfare aims described according to a life stage of the horse, NZTR's guidelines also indicate minimum provisions or standards that must be maintained and desired or optimal standards that should be achieved. The minimum acceptable welfare standards provide a measure for determining whether the person in charge of the horse is failing to meet welfare expectations for the care of the thoroughbred. It is important to note that these are higher standards than those enforced under New Zealand's Animal Welfare Act and associated codes and regulations. The guidelines therefore provide a basis for enforcement of increased levels of obligation under our rules of racing. NZTR will take an adaptive approach by revisiting these standards in future years. NZTR's assessment guidelines also align to new rules of racing that ensure accountability for persons involved with thoroughbreds, and specific powers of investigation and a clear basis for welfare charges. This table describes the overall benefit in ensuring earlier intervention with better welfare outcomes likely for the horse. NZTR has consulted with the Racing Integrity Unit, the SPCA and the Ministry for Primary Industries in enabling a framework where if welfare issues arise in the racing and breeding industry, that racing investigators are empowered to direct actions and potentially lay charges under the rules of racing. Or, if a serious breach, then the matter would be referred and dealt with by the government's appointed animal welfare inspectors, MPI or SPCA, as a breach of the law or regulation that may be proven beyond reasonable doubt and potentially result in a fine or criminal conviction. So what's the role of the equine vets? While racing investigators are appropriately empowered and have the advantage of seeking judgment and charges under the rules of racing on a balance of probabilities basis, they will often require a vet to provide an evidential basis for charges that would be laid. It's obviously of great benefit to ensure that equine vets in New Zealand are well aware of NZTR's welfare assessment guidelines and some key aspects of the welfare-related sections of the rules of racing. I'm always happy to assist them in this. Looking further ahead, the publication last year of NZTR's guidelines has been an important step in the continued enhancement of the care of thoroughbreds in New Zealand, but is not the conclusion or the end point. The understanding and acceptance within and outside the thoroughbred racing industry is essential. Work will now shift to more broad communication and information targeted to the care of retired thoroughbreds. Further ahead, knowledge gained from research and consequential enhancement in veterinary practice and husbandry, along with consideration of social tolerances for animal welfare issues, each line the pathway ahead and will require periodic revision of our welfare guidelines. As my presentation concludes, I invite everyone to spend an hour or so reviewing our guidelines, which can be found on the welfare section of our website, loveracing.co.nz. In the WVAC edition of the New Zealand Vet Journal, there's a paper written by Professor Meller and I, which I also invite your review. This concludes my presentation, which I hope has been of benefit or interest. I wish you all the best in your own endeavours and your enjoyment of the remainder of the Congress's series of webinars. Thanks for the opportunity to share what NZTR's Thoroughbred Welfare Guidelines. If anyone wishes to contact me, I'll be happy to hear from you. Thank you for your time and attention.
So now we are going to move on to the panel discussion, and indeed, actually, I think we've still got, well, if not all, almost all of the speakers, so we may be able to call on their experience too. But we've got 5 members of the panel joining us this evening or this morning. The first is Professor Natalie Warren, Dean of the Eastern Institute of Technology. And when I was chatting to Nat recently, we were reflecting on how much she has done for the world of research. And I think one of the things that she picked out was the establishment of the Animal Behaviour and Welfare MOOCs. And I'm not sure if you know what a MOOC is, but it's a massive open online course which he established in the University of Edinburgh. And literally hundreds of thousands of people have benefited from those courses in over 150 countries. So Nat brings a wealth of experience. Next, we have Dr. Joe Collins, who we've heard from the Donkey Sanctuary. When I was chatting to Joe, he said his proudest moment was winning the open team chase at in a team chase in Yorkshire, and his team were called the Forge Flyers. Slightly dodgily though, Joe's horse was called Fish, which was an ex-Olympic standard event horse, which was given it to him because Joe couldn't fix it. I'm delighted that Laura Skippen has joined us from the Brook, who we haven't heard from yet. We're greatly looking forward to hearing Laura on the panel. She qualified as a vet from the Royal Veterinary College in London, initially went into equine practice and has since joined the Brook, and she's now part of their global animal health team. And when I was chatting to Laura about the movement restrictions, or lockdown as we call them in the UK, she was musing that one of her best moments was seeing her 2 small sons in the kitchen having covered it in sugar and water. And when she politely asked them what they were doing, they said they'd found a tired bee outside that needed help. It's wonderful that the animal welfare gene grows so strongly in the Skippen household. Next, we have Professor Josh Slater, Head of Veterinary Clinical Services at the University of Melbourne. And I just like you all to know that Josh owes me a beer, because if it wasn't for me, he'd be sitting here yesterday morning why no one else was on the webinar with him. So I'm delighted Josh has got up on the right morning and is able to join us on the panel. And finally, Ben Sturgeon, who we've heard, vet director at Spana. And during the lockdown, he said one of his proudest moments is being able to get his kids off their computer games and outside, put on their bikes and getting muddy, as all kids should be doing. So we're going to have a panel this evening. It's an equine end of life panel, and the aim is just try to give a better understanding what we mean by quality of life, as we've heard in various presentations this evening, but specifically considering end of life issues. And we want to do that by looking at a few different contexts across the world. So the first question we're going to answer, or try to answer, is so let me just get get this properly going. Is how can we measure quality of life in equines? And the format is I'm going to ask each of the panelists to lead off on each of the questions. If there's any other comments from the other panelists, to pick them up. But if you do, and I can find where the chat function is, then do please look at, make some comments on the chat function, and I'll try and pick them up. We're slightly behind, and we sort of do need to try and finish around 0:00, so we'll do the best we can. So first, how can we measure quality of life in equines? Nat.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Rolly, and thanks so much to all the amazing speakers so far. In fact, a lot of what I plan to say has kind of been covered. So for those people who've tuned in and have stayed with us, then you'll probably find some of this quite familiar. I would start by saying that, as has been pointed out earlier, the field of animal welfare science emerged following the publication of the Bramble report in the 60s. And then you had the UK Farm Animal Welfare Council being born, and out of that came the ubiquitous 5 freedoms. Now, the same person who chaired the Bramble Report Committee was a chap called Professor Bramble, amazingly, and he addressed the first meeting of the Society of Veterinary Ethology, which is now called the International Society for Applied Ethology, in 1967. And at that time, he said, any sufficient estimate of an animal's welfare must be based on an understanding of the ethology of the species, as well as the very difficult question of what an animal feels. So he's already ahead of his time as we speak. However, it's taken since then, really, and only in the last few years, that we have started to really focus a lot more on the emotional health and well-being of our equids. And through the development of various research projects, we've been able to move a little bit beyond the original 5 freedoms, although they are still extremely useful and have been very useful, as Rolly's pointed out, but now to start to look at welfare being a far more multi-dimensional phenomenon, based very much on the animal's life experiences and circumstances, and of course characterized by how an individual animal feels as well as how it functions. And this has meant that we have started to see research focusing not just on the physical health of the animal, but also trying to address the very difficult question of the secret life of horses. What do they think? What do they feel? What's important to them? What is the quality of that animal's life, and how that relates to the balance of its negative as well as its positive emotional experiences, and not just in a particular moment in time or during a particular context, but also across its whole lifetime. And so I would argue that it's become increasingly important for us to make use of this quality of life concept to be able to allow owners and veterinarians, horse owners, to make reliable assessments about the balance of the animal's emotional state in relation to very familiar contexts for that horse, such as being handled or housed, transported, or during training, and also, of course, in the competition situation. And it also to allow the assessment of the animal's quality of life in regards to difficult decisions about the costs and benefits for an animal of particular treatment protocols, or for informing end-of-life decisions. So if an animal is going to be living a good life, we need to see the potential for much more positive experience and performance of positive behaviors. And these sorts of things will indicate that the life isn't just worth living, it's a good one. In order to do this, of course, we need to be able to focus not just on negative welfare indicators, things to do with the animal being in a fearful state or anxious or in pain. And these are things that actually we're not too bad at measuring. We're pretty focused in our culture on stress and so on. But we also need to be able to understand the positive emotions of the horse. And of course, horses can't self-report. People can, and in fact, sometimes you wouldn't necessarily believe what a person is telling you, but certainly a horse can't actually tell you how it feels. So we have to be able to measure it in some way. And we can't just assume that the absence of a negative state or negative indicators such as pain or fear means that the animal is actually enjoying a good quality of life. And my final point is I would say that owner observations, which are often used, and their opinion about their horse's welfare is actually quite relevant. And we've heard about qualitative behavioural assessment, and that can be quite useful, done in a structured way. But from the point of view of the horse, often the owner's observations and opinions are likely to be very biased. They're going to lack objectivity, particularly when it comes to emotional decisions that relate to the horse's welfare and actually also the horse's use. For example, where the owner is highly motivated to want to keep a horse competing, and we've seen this, and even though that horse might be showing negative indicators such as being very stressed or in pain, there's still a motivation for that owner rider to keep making that horse do something that it doesn't like. So for protecting equine welfare, what we need is robust evidence-based methods that assess positive welfare indicators or emotional states, and then we can start to look at the balance of those negative states in relation to the opportunity for more positive emotional experiences, so that we can start to build up a profile of what it means for a horse to be in a positive welfare state and to have a high or a good life. And these sorts of things that indicate positive states of mind might relate to things to do with being able to perform a whole variety of behaviours, showing a lot of play behaviour, affiliative behaviours such as mutual grooming, and anticipatory behaviour of something good that's likely to happen. The problem at the moment is that we don't know very much about some of these indicators, and there's obviously quite a lot of research that we need to be doing if we're going to make sound, robust, quality of life decisions for horses.
Nat, thank you very much. We're obviously under time pressure. Josh, is there anything you wanted to add from your perspective around measuring quality of life?
From just in general, or about the older horse?
About before we go on to the geriatric horse, about picking up on what Nat's talked about.
Yeah, no, I think Nat makes some really, really important points there, and I think that it's the biases that everyone brings. I think in particular owners, which do make quality of life assessments difficult. With the best will in the world, I think a lot of people who live with animals become slightly blind to the way that they're keeping them and the quality of life that those horses have. So I think as Nat's talked about, having tools that everybody can use to try to objectively assess quality of life is so important.
Thank you, Josh. So then let's move on to talking about what's different about donkeys. Joe, will you kick us off on that?
Right. My microphone's unmuted, I hope. Now rolling?
It is indeed.
Fantastic. Well, donkeys are not small horses with big ears, and I have been guilty for most of my veterinary career in treating them like small horses. And I think it's a significant mistake that many in the veterinary profession still make. I'm not an expert on donkeys. I don't claim to be one at this point, but I've increasingly understood how different they are. Now, some of those are quite clinical veterinary differences to do, for example, with castration of donkeys. I now castrate donkeys under general anesthesia. Is a closed technique. I am very, very careful about excising scrotal fat in a way that I wouldn't have thought about for horses 20 years ago. But that's not really the context in which we want to discuss donkeys this evening. So picking up a little bit more on what Nat was talking about, donkeys' big issue for me in terms of quality of life and end-of-life decision-making is that they adopt this masking behavior. Now, it's often been called stoicism. I don't think it's properly called that. I think it's our lack, really, rather than the donkey's lack. They have evolved largely to reduce the scale at which they express their emotions, and that's misinterpreted by us as meaning that they don't experience them to the same level that horses do. But that is our mistake and not their mistake. And we often don't have the subtlety to, and the patience, dare I say, in this modern world, to spend enough time looking, observing, being patient and not interfering, but stepping back and allowing these animals to demonstrate normal behaviors and then developing the skills. And I'm thinking, about younger veterinarians and vet schools and veterinary nurses who need to develop the ability to stop, to watch, to look, to observe, and to learn how to interpret what the animals are showing us. And for donkeys, that can be more difficult. I was amazed with 2 experiences in Egypt working at a veterinary hospital where the other clinicians with me told me that these animals had gastric impactions to the point of being non-treatable. And I just couldn't understand this. I said that these animals are not displaying much in the way of clinical signs, vital signs, physiology, respiratory rate, heart rate, etc., etc. And we couldn't save these animals, and they died. And when I post-mortem them, I was just astounded to see the extent of pathology, gastric pathology. So these animals simply didn't display in the way that horses would. The other in the donkey sanctuary that has really impacted upon how I deal with end-of-life issues with donkeys is the bonding nature of donkeys. It's much more pronounced for donkeys than it is for horses. And so we in the donkey sanctuary, when we have an animal, a bonded animal that we have to euthanize on veterinary grounds, we are now very, very careful about the companions, because if we're not so careful, we end up with a companion with hyperlipemia and often with fatal consequences. And I've had this experience personally a number of times in which having euthanized one of a bonded group or a bonded pair, it's the companion that suffers tremendous emotional responses, negative responses, to the point, particularly if the animal is obese, as many, unfortunately, of our donkeys in Great Britain and Ireland are, can develop a very profound emotional response, which leads to a loss of appetite and then to metabolic consequences and hyperlipemia and death. So there are 2 key differences that I'd like to highlight to colleagues dealing with end-of-life issues in donkeys. There are some practical ones related to pharmacology, for example. Donkeys have a very efficient metabolic system compared to many horses, which leads to this obesity problem. But there are some significant differences then with drug metabolism, with half-lives and drug clearance times. The Donkey Sanctuary has produced a free text available in text form, but also a printed form, but also online to any of our colleagues who are interested across a whole range of topics, including clinical veterinary topics. And I encourage anyone listening to this who is interested to access the Donkey Sanctuary website, where they will get access for free to those resources.
Thank you, Joe. I mean, Nat talked about a lack of research and a lack of understanding around quality of life in horses and equines. I assume within donkeys, you've talked about a number of areas where there are differences, but in terms of quality of life specifically, I assume there's a bit of a lack of research in that too.
The Donkey Sanctuary are, of course, very invested in this area. We're very much an evidence-based organisation. We have a large research department headed by Dr. Faith Burden, and so we invest a lot of time, energy, and resources in research in this area across a whole variety of areas, whether it's sarcoids, sweet itch, clinical veterinary matters, but we're very, very invested in this particular area, which is looking at quality of life and end-of-life decision-making and helping to guide not only the veterinary profession, but many other people in this area. I'm not aware that so many other organisations would focus on the topic in the way that we do.
Brilliant, thank you. The other panellists, Laura or Ben, is there anything you want to add to in the discussion around donkeys and quality of life?
I think the issues in the donkey population sort of globally are slightly different. Obviously, Joe's been talking about obesity and the pair bonding seen, and obviously those issues are perhaps seen less in the population that we're dealing with. And there's definitely less research about that kind of decision-making process. But it would be good to see it being done, definitely, because those issues must exist with pair bonding and the sort of the groups they live in and things. So,
brilliant, thank you, Laura. Since you're speaking, we've got a question now around why worry about the Ezhou trade, and we've heard from James earlier about this, but relating it specifically to end-of-life issues. I am trying to change the slide. I'm just not very good at it. But whilst I'm struggling with my technology, I'll
carry on.
You carry on.
I think having seen James's presentation, you'd have to say, why wouldn't you worry about it, really? But specifically with regard to the end-of-life issues, I think it's fair to say that none of the donkeys that are being slaughtered in this trade are having a good death, which was obviously mentioned by Alana as being a sort of vital part of quality of life and what we consider a good life as well. In a 2019 study in Kenya, they found that the 4 gazetted slaughterhouses were slaughtering many, many more donkeys, in some cases up to 100% more donkeys than they were procuring humane slaughter bullets from the KSPCA, which obviously begs the question how they were performing any stunning prior to slaughter. And video footage that was taken in a slaughterhouse in Tanzania showed that they were using chains around the neck and then bludgeoning donkeys with hammers as a method of stunning, which is obviously in contravention of all sorts of international animal welfare standards set by the OIE, and indeed many national welfare standards in Kenya and Tanzania as well. And that's really just the legal trade. The illegal trade can be even more unpleasant, where donkeys are stolen from their owners. They're either travelled long distances, often by foot. James mentioned that they'll be starved and dehydrated because it's easier to remove their skin, or that's what they believe. Obviously not something personal experience of there. But otherwise they're often killed in the bush because it's easier to remove their skin and just transport that. And that will involve the donkey having its legs broken or being beaten to incapacitate it before they kill it. James, in fact, told me that one of the partner staff that we work with met an owner who'd found his donkey alive, but without its skin. So I think it shows that there's just some hideous animal welfare issues occurring. And as we achieve great things like the ban in Kenya, the demand is still there. And so this trade will be moving to other places around the world and other donkey populations will be at risk. So even for those listening who perhaps don't see it as something that is an issue in their area yet, it could become one. So yeah, I think it's something we should all be concerned about as animal welfare professionals and vets. Thank you, Laura. Ben, obviously Spana, through your direct work and through the International Coalition for Working Equids in collaboration, I know you've had a significant experience. Do you want to add anything to that? I'm wondering whether Ben is muted or there. So Joe, I know you Donkey Sanctuary obviously have also had
Is that better?
Oh, Ben, you there?
Oh, sorry, I seem to have come back in. I don't know what happened there. Yeah, no, I was just going to say, really, actually, I would, if you like, just say thank you because to all the panelists around the table, because actually the reaction to the Ajao trade has been, by the very scale of it, it needed to be a collaborative effort. You know, so I think, you know, to say we had ICWE, the International Coalition of Working Equids, which is Brooks, Spahn, World Horse Welfare, and the Donkey Sanctuary acting together in numerous different fashions to try and address it has been extremely encouraging, and as James highlighted, has had some very significant advances.
Thank you, Ben. Joe, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, absolutely I do. You know, Rolly, you and I have been in China together and explored this issue, dare I say, on the ground. And we estimate that the Chinese, you know, 30 years ago had maybe 11 or 12 million donkeys in their country. And we estimate that it's now down more like 4 to 5 million, something of that order, because the demand for this product has been so enormous as their middle classes have expanded through economic growth. And I think James referred to this, that there are many people who would aspire to a more affluent lifestyle, and the Ajao has positioned itself as a luxury product. It is the product that you give to your relation as a sign, a signal of your value, you know, in them. And so they've been it's been very successful in that regard from a commercial perspective. But the effect on the donkey population has been dramatic, and because the local sourcing of product of live donkey, there was in China, has not been up to the mark, there's been this voracious appetite for donkey skins, as we all know, they're coming from across the world. And there's hardly a country now in the world, or certainly there isn't a continent in the world, which hasn't been affected by this. And some of it has been what you might call a legitimate trade, in the sense of a legal trade. And as we know, Kenya had 4 licensed slaughterhouses for export, which have now had their licenses revoked only last month. But the trade, you know, we've seen evidence of this trade in Australia, we've seen evidence of it in South America, in Mexico, and we have found a trader based in the European Union who has been perhaps not sourcing the donkeys, but has been part of this chain. And so it's worldwide, it's global, and you know, it has, as others have said, and James has really spoken to us from the ground in Kenya, it has had a dramatic impact, not only on the animals themselves, but on the people who depend on them. And he has very rightly said that, and there's a link here with what Danielle was talking about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, because donkeys are the beast of burden in many parts of the world. And without donkeys, it is women who largely suffer, and it is children who are not going to school. So there's a huge negative impact on people as well as on donkeys. And we're equine welfare organisations, but we have to also bear that in mind. So I'm delighted to see exposure of this particular issue in this forum.
Yeah, I would also
Laura,
add to that.
Sorry.
Sorry, but Laura first and then Ben.
No, I just happened to notice that we'd had a question actually about the impact of COVID-19 on the donkey skin trade. And one of the interesting things has been that in China, Ajao has been promoted as a cure for COVID-19. And so therefore, actually, we may see an increase in demand. And therefore, it could have a poor impact on it. And certainly, we haven't anecdotally had any, for instance, in Ethiopia, our team have said that the markets are still selling donkeys, and, you know, the trade is continuing. Because it's an illegal trade in Ethiopia, it's not abiding by any current sort of social distancing or laws on that. So just to answer that question.
Yeah. Ben, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I'll probably add to what Laura said as well. James intimated on biosecurity issues with regards to the donkey trade, and we heard about the equine influenza outbreak in Niger, for example, last year, and certainly that was the World Health Organization directly linked that to the illegal movement of animals and cited the movement of donkeys as a possible cause of that outbreak of equine influenza that killed in excess of 60,000 animals. So certainly, you know, it has similar kind of situation to the COVID-19, you know, where we find ourselves now. The second point was, I suppose, just a red flag to everybody. The FAO stat quoted in, you know, their most recent figures quote 54.8 million donkeys globally, but Chinese demand is approximately 4.8 million skins a year. At this current rate, donkeys will be extinct in 9 years, and that's a very sobering fact.
There's a few chats coming through around the concept of using the concept of one welfare, which absolutely. And I suppose a note of encouragement, because it's very difficult to deal with fact here because we don't know. But certainly, Joe mentioned that we'd been over in China, obviously not this year, but last year. And the indication there was demand was going down. And let's hope that that's true, because we've heard from James and Laura and the panel, you know, what a horrific trade this is. And we could talk about it all evening, morning, stroke afternoon, but I'm afraid we can't. So we'll need to move on. So the next question is, what's different in geriatric equines? And Josh, whilst I faff around trying to get us onto the right slide, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Rowley. I must say, hard to follow that last discussion. Very distressing hearing this. But on to geriatrics. Of course, most of the horses that the horse trusts have are retired, and many of them are geriatric. This is very much a UK perspective I'm going to present. I'm conscious that attitudes to geriatric horses will vary around the world, and it'd be great to get some comments from everyone who's still listening to this discussion. But I'd like to begin with a question about what do we mean by a geriatric horse, and then how does that perception of a geriatric horse affect decision making? And Nat and Alana have talked, I think, very effectively about this, but certainly as far as we're concerned, there's no absolute definition, no fixed point at which a horse becomes a geriatric. This really is all about quality of life assessments and being very clear that animal has a good life, and that can continue into very old age, or may not continue beyond a very young age. So I think a good place to begin this discussion is to challenge any perception that being geriatric occurs at a particular number of years. It really doesn't. But I do think that perception of age, as we've heard during the session, does impact on the way owners and vets make decisions about how they keep old horses, about preventive healthcare, in particular whether preventive healthcare is still provided or not. So people may make decisions to not vaccinate because the horse is no longer in work, it's no longer doing a job, and so is there any point spending money on it? Perhaps they don't get as much dental care as they should. Certainly impacts on treatment, and a few, I think a few misconceptions out there about old horses perhaps not recovering well, or not hearing well, or maybe they won't survive anaesthesia as well as younger horses do, or perhaps there's no point thinking about pain relief except for a bute a day, and if that's not, and that's sort of all that you need to do. So I think those discussions we've heard during the presentations about bias, I think, are really, really important. Some of the things in Britain, at least, that make geriatric and retired horses very different is that they are retired. They're no longer doing a job. They're no longer in work. And this means that they are not going to be sold on. So if you think about competition horses and race horses going on into other lives, they will go on and do other things. But a geriatric retired horse is usually not going to be sold on. It's going to be kept by its owner, and there's this very strong emotional bond, very strong emotional involvement between the owner and the horse. And I think there's been some excellent points about how that bond, that emotional connection, can blind the keeper of that horse to that horse's true state. And Alana made some really good points about how that can then cloud decision making about quality of life. And you know, we often in veterinary hospitals in the UK often have discussions about, is it worth treating this horse? Say it's a horse with colic or whatever. Is it worth treating it because it's old? And if that animal has a good quality of life, and if the owner wants to treat it, then I don't think age should be any barrier to horses receiving treatment. The fact that an animal is old is not justification for not treating it. But I do think one of the things that is different in older horses when it comes to making treatment decisions are those horses which have multiple pathologies. And like all individuals, as they get older, some horses will accumulate issues, typically degenerative joint disease, osteoarthritis, lameness, combined perhaps with dental disease. And then maybe when some other major disease event or some other issue arises with that horse, that's that point at which its quality of life really needs to be thought about. And that would, for us, be a point at which you start to think, well, is it reasonable to treat this animal because of this accumulating number of pathologies that the horse has? I know we're short of time, really, but just a couple of other points. I really did think that the point that both Nat and Alana have made about the difficulty for individual owners in making appropriate end-of-life decisions with older horses was really important, because like older dogs, a lot of these horses experience sort of gradual progressive deterioration, and that accumulates slowly over days, months and years, and owners may be it may be quite difficult for owners to assess what the animal's quality of life really is like. And so having that vet-owner partnership to come up with that objective assessment of quality of life and appropriate end-of-life decision is really important. And I think moving people on from, how often have we heard people saying, oh, well, he's just a bit stiff. Actually, this is a horse with significant chronic pain, multi-limb lameness pain, and yes, it may look stiff, but actually this is an animal which needs either to have more effective pain relief, or decisions need to be made about whether it's reasonable for that animal to continue on with its life. And I think, final thought, in Britain at least, a lot of geriatric horses live on their own. And some of the cues for telling us that horse's quality of life is not what it should be come from that horse's interaction with other horses. We've heard about the 5 domains previously, and I think it's much easier to pick up those cues where horses live in groups, because they stop interacting with their friends in the normal way. And I think where someone has an old horse that lives in a paddock on its own, it's much harder to pick up those cues. And again, something else that clouds decision making on quality of life. So I think I'll stop there, really, because we're approaching time, I can see.
No, Josh, that's great. Thank you very much. It's an interesting comment that's just come through, but in many parts of the US, horses are more likely to be sold and dumped, older horses. And the question, wondered whether it was due to many people grew up in urban environments without facilities, and often they were overhorsed and underfunded. There's a lot of resonance there, I think, in terms of the challenges, aren't there?
Yes, and I forget who made the comments earlier, but this idea that taking on a horse is a lifelong, I think it was Alana who made this point, it's a lifelong commitment, and you have to plan ahead to the end. It's not just about the fun times that were when you're riding the horse or doing whatever you're doing with it, and you think about vet costs, farrier costs, feed costs. It's about planning ahead for end of life as well, and the cost of that, yeah.
Thank you. Ironic, I was in the British Army, Royal Army Veterinary Corps in the 90s, and we defined as horses at 50 would be retired. Working animals. It's amazing that think of that now. Nat, we've got a question here about what do you do when you lose an animal and their companion? How do we know anything about companion grief? And you're often told that actually you should allow the horse or donkey to go and see the animal after it's dead. Do we know anything about the latest sort of thinking behind that?
Yeah, thanks for that. Yes, it's a really interesting question. and obviously, again, riddled with opinion and belief rather than necessarily any great research. However, I would say that I was lucky to have a PhD student who spent 3 or 4 years of her life looking at animal grief and trying to find ways of looking at this in a very objective, rigorous way. It's really difficult. She didn't look at horses, but she did look at whether or not dogs, cats, and she also looked at cattle, showed some sort of consistent changes that would help us to understand their emotional state during the long time, during a long period. And I mean, if you think about it, a lot of the time, what you might see as being grieving in the sort of human sense, which is a very emotional, anxious, long-term depressed state, often what you're seeing when an animal loses a companion might be seen as being more to do with a change in circumstance. The animal obviously no longer being in a social group that it's used to being in, not necessarily having an animal that it's used to following, that signals things to it, like where's the food. And obviously, if you've got donkeys, we know that they do bond hugely, and that they don't necessarily have their bonded individual who they're used to going to for comfort and companionship. So, I would say that in terms of animals, that animals do show lots of signs that demonstrate to us that that change in circumstance is hugely stressful to them and hugely disturbing. However, whether it's grief in the way that humans would talk about grief is probably quite debatable, but it's significant to them. Now, the other question about whether that means that you do certain things, like allow an animal to see whether another one has died, again, really difficult, because when we've done a little bit of research around this, it does look like animals don't really seem to have a concept of death, not in the way that we do, like the animal's never coming back. And but again, what they see is an animal not responding in a normal way. And maybe not responding in a normal way could be seen as more disturbing to the animal than the animal just going away. So I just leave that out there because I don't know the answer to it.
Brilliant. And I've just been asked, maybe through Webinar Vet, we could, the reference you referred to there, Nat, someone's asked for it, so maybe we could put that up on the chat function before the end. Now we will move on to our last question. This is really a whistle-stop tour around the world, but what are the challenges of euthanasia for working equids? Obviously, Alana touched on this, and Ben, what are these challenges?
Thank you, really. Yeah, I think, again, I'll echo some of the previous speakers. The first thing we can't ignore is the value of these animals to people, in developmental countries, relying on them for their livelihoods, relying on them for, sustainability, satisfying the sustainable development goals within the African countries, developing the One Health theory, which links to economic, social, environmental value, etc. It's a huge aspect of euthanasia because these animals are so important. So presenting them for euthanasia is a major issue for owners. I took the liberty of looking at our own clinics across the world and looking at the average euthanasia rates, and actually they're extremely low. In Mauritania, 0.0067%, in Zimbabwe 0.0045%, and Morocco 0.5%. They're extremely low, but with absolute respect to the vets, I don't think it tells a story of necessarily excellent vet care. I think it tells a story of difficulty of euthanasia. And I think it really falls into the three kind of areas of challenge. The first thing is entirely practical, having access to quality drugs such as thiopental and potassium chloride. Just simply getting access to those drugs in a working environment can be difficult. Equally, use of firearms, the availability of the resource alongside training of these things is difficult to provide for some vets in development countries who've never actually handled equids or handled firearms. And to go back to Joe's point upon the differences between horses and donkeys, simply putting a catheter in a working donkey is very different from a catheter in a horse. Dealing with, as Joe said, dealing with the companion of the animal you may euthanize with regards to onset of depression as such, hypolipemia, etc., a real practical issue that people will have. Then there's obviously cost of euthanasia. We're in a working scenario where people rely on them, have very little disposal income, so the cost of euthanasia as well as disposal can be extremely difficult. And that disposal could enter a food chain, for example, if slaughterhouses were available for that scenario. But equally, we have to think about disposal in some of these countries where actually disposable may be quite rough and ready. And in terms of wildlife, may have access to some of these animals that are put down for other reasons, such as brucella or African horse sickness, and may spread into an environment. Equally, we're dealing with abandoned animals as well, and so there's often that difficulty of legal compliance with national laws, with the police, with a potential owner, and an out-of-hours situation. Another practical problem, it sounds daft, but literacy and understanding. It is important, or in the Western situation, we demand informed consent of why we're euthanizing an animal. Sometimes people find it hard to accept the reasons for the euthanasia and actually struggle to understand that reason for it. And lastly, in a working scenario, at least for a vet, there are significant time pressures. We have the luxury often in a Western environment of hospitalizing animal or providing treatment and then reviewing the response to that treatment. And that gives us, again, a very good eye prognosis. Often we might see this animal for a short period of time, quite literally 5 or 10 minutes, and have to make the decision there and then, sometimes without diagnostic modalities. So it puts real practical problems onto a vet in that situation. The next issue is, as we've already heard about, religious or cultural issues, or even just owner issues. And the first owner issue is just simply we don't get presented some of these animals. There is an element of trust that needs to go on in a clinic. Owners are scared of being reprimanded. They lack the knowledge to understand what a severe or injury may be to a horse, or maybe what a chronic injury and how that may influence the quality of life and its ability to work. They have no alternative income, as we've suggested. Sometimes they simply refuse the diagnosis. Even with very severe injuries, such as a septic joint or a surgical colic or a badly healed fracture, they still think that animal can work. And so, and because it's their only source of income, will urge for non-euthanasia as such. And equally, they'll believe in spontaneous recovery. Through a culture belief called animism, where they believe that animals have a soul and a spirit, rightly or wrongly, and hence, they want to give these animals a chance because of that belief. And then we have various religious issues where euthanasia is not only prohibited, but it's absolutely condemned as well. So we're often working in that delicate cultural environment to try and encourage euthanasia as an act of compassion. Lastly, the vet, him or herself, can experience legal, ethical issues to themselves. Again, in Western environments, we can manage acute diseases and we can try and manage chronic diseases to give an animal a quality life. However, in again, developmental countries with work animals, we won't have access to drugs, we won't have access to revisit animals, to review the response to treatment. So it's very, very difficult to provide that ongoing care to ensure quality of life. Simple availability of analgesic medications doesn't exist. Often we also lack legislation within countries. Animal welfare acts are either non-existent or extremely aged. Often we cannot euthanize without consent. Hence, we often have to, involve police. We have to try and source an owner. It is very, very difficult from that scenario. Vets won't have access to second opinions. There are very, very few working equine vets in these countries. So the ability to bounce the idea and actually cover yourself, if you like, in making these decisions is absent as well. So they're the kind of three main issues that we have, these real practical issues on a day-to-day basis, dealing with cultural sensitivities, and then dealing with some of the luxuries, if you like, that we have in the Western environment just simply don't exist overseas. Some of the solutions, and I don't have them all at all, I have to say, from a practical perspective, free euthanasia is offered liaising with local authorities to dispose of animals is offered. I know one of the audience members, Hannah Zudu from Ethiopia, gives out her mobile phone number to people so that if owners refuse to have an animal euthanized, but we know that it has effectively a life-threatening condition, they can phone her day or night and she will go out and deal with it. Another audience member, Professor Hassan Al-Talain, equally can provide or does provide replacement animals for some people who cannot afford to replace his animals that he's had abandoned, made healthy, and he'll replace those animals. From a religious perspective, it is very difficult. Again, it's developing trust, try and have people understand that this is an act of compassion rather than an affront to a religion. But it is a very, very delicate scenario. And from a veterinary perspective, it's a whole kind of minefield. We just need to encourage that open discussion, to advocate for changes in legislation, to encourage animal welfare laws, the enforcement of those laws, the Veterinary Surgeons Act, etc. But it's a whole mishmash of things that are going into a big melting pot to try and assist and make end-of-life situations much easier for the people involved, the actual owners themselves, the vets performing the duties, and obviously, of course, for the animals to make it as humane as possible.
And thank you very much. Laura, from your perspective, is there anything, I mean, that's a very comprehensive answer from Ben there. Any thoughts from you?
I think, yeah, absolutely, very comprehensive from Ben, covered loads. I think one of the things that we see, and maybe it's because we obviously don't have the same level of clinics and hospitals, is that we work with a lot of people who aren't vets, who are what we call animal health practitioners, so paravets, people who might have qualifications, sort of maybe a 3-year sort of qualification, but maybe only 6 months. And so everything that you feel as a vet when you're euthanizing a horse and the decision-making process is 100 times harder for them. Not only do they have the same lack of access to the drugs and the equipment, but they don't always know how to use it, even if they do have it. And therefore for them it's a decision of, will they make things better or worse? They, as Ben said, don't have access to referral systems. So I think that's one of the big issues that we see, is that actually there are very few vets doing these jobs, and it's mainly people who are less qualified than vets having to make these difficult decisions, sometimes not even recognizing that euthanasia is necessary, because for them what they're seeing is normal. And only when you've seen what we would consider a normal animal would they recognize that that's not normal, and not having the confidence to do it themselves. So yeah, that would be another challenge that we see.
Thank you very much, Laura. I'm aware now it's 12 minutes after the hour, so I've failed as a job of trying to keep us to time. But we've obviously galloped around a huge amount of issues, and I just wanted to finish up by asking each of the panelists, just and because we're so short of time, if you can keep your comments really, really brief, but just what some concluding comments, anything, a takeaway message that that comes out of our discussion over the last 45 minutes. Maybe if I could go in order of speakers. So Nat, any final comments from you?
Thank you, Rolly. Wow. I would just say that I think that this session, even though it's been a remote session, has been one of the most amazing sort of gathering of information, and allowed us to actually, because of the chat boxes and so on, look at all of the different questions that are coming out from people all over the world. So I suppose in conclusion, I would just say that there's still a long way to go, I think, before we can say confidently that we're able to provide for all of the emotional and behavioural needs of equines, whether they be working or in developing countries, or sports and recreation horses that are expected to enjoy a good life. But in some cases, as we've seen today, there are a whole array of different questions that we need to be able to answer and address if we're going to be sure that we're actually doing that. However, I would say that it gives me a lot of heart to see that we are now talking very confidently about equine emotions. We're talking very confidently and in a very accepting way of the importance of horses, donkeys and mules, wherever they are in the world, being able to have the potential to enjoy a good life. And I think that in itself is a big move forward.
Thank you, Nat. Josh?
Sorry, just to mute myself. Yeah, completely echo all those points. And I think for me, an encouragement to all of us in the vet profession to have the confidence to engage with owners with those difficult discussions about end-of-life decisions. We are there as the horse's guardian. And I think it's really, really important we start to encourage owners to plan ahead, think about when that decision is going to be made, how it's going to be made, and use all of the amazing tools on quality of life and so on, which are now coming out. It's much easier to have these conversations now. So an encouragement to all of us to get on the front foot and to do that.
Brilliant. Thank you. Laura?
Yeah, I think it's been really exciting for me to see Working Equids being on a panel where other sort of where sports horses and leisure horses and things are included alongside Working Equids, so that they're being given a sort of equal weight. And that for me has been a really great part of today. It's, yeah, been fantastic to be on it.
Brilliant. Joe?
Sorry, Rolly. Two things. One is to remind all of my colleagues that donkeys are different and we need to treat them as donkeys and not as horses. So we need to try and walk in their hooves. And the second thing in relation to the jow trade, it's that we really need to get people to understand that, you know, we do not need and do not want to decimate the population of working equids in the world for this trade. I mean, there are alternatives. Alternatives are possible, and we really just need to remove this fixation on requiring donkey gelatin, even black donkey skin gelatin as a product that has legitimacy, because it doesn't. And the animals that are suffering and the people that are suffering as a consequence really deserve so much better. And I want to say very much thank you to the World Veterinary Association for the opportunity to be involved in this. It's been a fantastic experience, and well done to you, Rolly, for your chairing.
Thank you. Ben?
Yeah, thank you. Again, I think I echo everybody else's thoughts. I think the key point I would say is animal health and human health are intricately linked. It's so obvious in today's age, in these last few months, how close that link is. We as vets here represent the animals and animal health, and by doing so, we're going to help our fellow human beings. So well done, everybody. Keep up what you're doing. You represent a much bigger picture.
Brilliant. We could go on and on, but for some, I know in India and Pakistan, it is in the middle of the night. It's getting to the middle of the night in the UK, and I know for some of you it's rather surreal. I have a screen here that has the hemispheres: the northern hemisphere, Joe and Laura in the dark, and the southern hemisphere, Nat and Josh, very much in the light. Maybe it was always thus, but I just wanted to say a huge thank you on your behalf to all of our speakers. To Nat, to Daniela, to Ben, to Joe, to Josh, to James, to Alana, to Martin, and then our panel, including Laura. It's been a fascinating sort of trip, and there's been so much insightful comment and certainly a huge amount of diversity. So a great big thank you to all of you as speakers, and as many of you said, to the World Veterinary Association Congress for putting this on. It would have been lovely to have been in New Zealand. This is a long second place, but if it had to be this way, then it's been absolutely brilliant, and it's been great to be together. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to the World Veterinary Association and to Lottie and to Shannon who've put this on, and to Webinar Vet for, and technically it seems to have worked, other than my inept way of trying to work the screen, has worked extremely well. So thank you very much. Thank you to all of our supporting organisations, and I very much hope we will meet again very soon. I should also add that the recordings of the webinar is going to be available within 48 hours on the website, and that's in the chat box at the moment. And CPD and continuing education certificates will also be available. There is a goodie bag. There's always got to be a goodie bag with entries from the sponsors, and that's available during the festival. And Catherine will pop a link in the chat box. And there's going to be 107 hours of CPD, continuing education, available on the World Veterinary Association Congress site, and so please do get a ticket and go and look at those. So much to get into. Thank you to Zeev and Patricia at the World Veterinary Association Congress for putting this on, and I wish you all to take great care, and I look forward to seeing you very soon.